Good morning, everyone. I'm Mike Lovell. I'm the president of Marquette University, and I want to welcome all of you here to Marquette and our wonderful law school. And many thanks to our law school dean, Joe Kearney, who you're going to hear from in a second, and also our university libraries dean, Janice Welburn, for really making this happen today and getting us all together for a great conversation. I also want to thank the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. You're going to hear from David Haynes in a little bit. For its strong support for this program today as well. And we're really proud of our law school, not just for the physical space it provides, but for the important leadership position it has taken over the years on issues that are facing our country. And certainly the national experts we're going to hear from today are going to talk about some important things related to libraries and how they're evolving and changing in our country. And today's forum is supported in part of something known as the Lubar Fund for Public Policy Research, funded by Shell and Marianne Lubar, who are obviously two great leaders, within our city, and really help us put on events like we're going to have today. Now, I think we all know libraries have a special place in our society, and certainly in the hearts of people who teach and learn at universities, and also in the general public and for K through 12 schools. But libraries are obviously changing, and the ways that we access the information and the way libraries obtain information are evolving, significantly evolving. But I can just tell you, being on a college campus, they still remain the epicenter for learning for our faculty, staff, and students. And they also remain an important gathering place. If you go to the library anytime during midterm or finals, you'll see how busy our library is. And how important they are to really the way the campus, operates. And so I think you can also appreciate that libraries are also a place where we can have important dialogue and discuss different opinions. In our library today, you can go read works from authors like J.R. Tolkien to journalist Dorothy Day. You can do the readings from our former governor, Tommy Thompson, to Congressman Clement Zablocki. Two very, very different opinions evolved from those groups. But there are also places where we can have a very collegial conversation about differences we may have and learn from each other. And, I hope that today you have an excellent conversation and you all can think about what the future of the American Library looks like, because I can tell you that I know that libraries are going to change and they're going to evolve, but they're still going to remain really important for not only what we do on our campus, but what we do in society. So again, I want to welcome all to Marquette University, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you, President Lovell, and good morning, everyone. My name is Joseph Kearney, and it's a great privilege for me as Dean of Marquette University Law School to welcome you to Eckstein Hall in today's conference. As President Lovell has said, I do this on behalf also of Dave Haynes of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Permit me to begin with a logistical point or two. We expect to conclude the program by 12 noon. You can contribute to that by helping us to keep the two breaks, which are reflected on the program, to 10 minutes each, as is our plan. I should add as well that with most speakers or panels, all but Mr. Franklin's and Mr. Gerdes, I believe, we intend to include time to take questions from you, the audience. My primary interest is to introduce the person whose work inspired this gathering. Wayne Wiegand is not just a friend of mine and Marquette Law School more generally. His wife Shirley is Emerita Professor of Law here, but a scholar of the first rank. Indeed, he is often referred to as the Dean of American Library Historians, and you may be sure that I, at least, don't use the Dean title lightly. He is currently the F. William Summers Professor of Library and Information Studies Emeritus at Florida State University. His previous appointments included service as a longtime faculty member at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he led the founding of the Center for the History of Print Culture in Modern America and served as its co-director. Professor Wiegand is the editor or author of a dozen or more books, but it is this book, A People's History of the American Public Library, I should add, Part of Our Lives, A People's History of the American Public Library, published just this fall by the Oxford University Press, that has brought us together. It is, in the words of one review, utterly wonderful. I could characterize or describe the book further, but the most useful thing that I can do is to make way for Professor Wayne Wiegand. Won't you please welcome him?
It kind of feels like I'm home. My wife spent 12 wonderful years here, loved the faculty, best place she said she ever worked. And this past summer, we celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary, and a lot of her talk about the 50 years was about Marquette. So thank you, Marquette, for inviting me. I have a huge goal here today. Whoops, I got to start this. There we go. To persuade you to broaden your thinking about libraries in general and public libraries in particular. I'm motivated in large part because of conclusions that emerged from research on a book I've recently published called Part of Our Lives, A People's History of the American Public Library. My goal in that book was to find out historically why people love these ubiquitous civic institutions. And love them they do. A 2013 report by the Pew Research Center's Internet and American Life Project noted that in the previous decade, every other major institution, government, churches, banks, corporations, has fallen in public esteem except libraries, the military, and first responders. The study also found that 91% of those surveyed over 16 years old said libraries are important to their communities, and 98% identified their public library experiences as positive. Another Pew study found 94% of parents believe libraries are important for their children, 84% because libraries develop a love of reading and books. In my historical narrative, I didn't take the conventional user in the life of the library approach. Rather, I took a library in the life of the user perspective because I wanted to trace the history of the public library not so much by analyzing the words of its founders and its managers, but mostly by listening to the voices of people who used them since the middle of the 19th century. Thus, instead of a top-down view, Part of Our Lives adopts a bottom-up perspective that features the voices of generations of library users. Largely because of recent technologies, uncovering many of these voices was not difficult. Time-consuming, yes, but not difficult. Some are published in memoirs, autobiographies, and biographies of the famous, some in manuscript collections and public library archives across the country. The vast majority, however, are fixed in thousands of U.S. newspapers and periodicals digitized since the 1990s into huge databases. By using public library as a search term, I found thousands of voices and letters to the editor, thousands more quoted in stories reporters wrote about local libraries. As I analyzed this data, I was surprised at how quickly it organized into three main categories. In no particular order, people have loved their public libraries. Let me make sure. Yep. People have loved their public libraries for the useful information they made accessible, for the public spaces they provided, and for the transformative potential of commonplace stories they circulated that help users make sense of their world. First, a few examples that comfortably fit the category of information as we currently define it in librarianship. While sitting at the Cincinnati Public Library desk in 1867, Thomas Edison compiled a bibliography on electricity. A colleague later recalled, many times Edison would get excused from duty under pretense of being too sick to work, and invariably strike a beeline for the library, where he'd spend the entire day and evening reading such works on electricity as were to be had. In 1899, Wilbur and Orville Wright came upon an ornithology book in the Dayton Public Library that rekindled their interest in human flight, one of their biographers writes. In a Detroit Public Library reading room in the 1950s, a teenage female pored over comedians' printed monologues, Lily Tomlin's biographer later noted. She appeared in short monodramas written by herself without makeup and hardly any props, conjuring up not only the personality of the character she portrayed, but also that of unseen people with whom she was talking. About the same time in Hot Springs, Arkansas, 10-year-old William Jefferson Clinton discovered the Garland County Public Library. I'd go there for hours browsing among the books, especially those on Native Americans, he said, which probably explains that shirt. In a Detroit ghetto in 1962, Sonia Carson, a single African-American mother frustrated with poor school performance and all the television her 11-year-old son Benny and his older brother were watching, made a decision. From now on, she said, you boys can watch no more than 3 programs a week. Instead, they were to go to their local Detroit Public Library branch. You're going to read at least 2 books every week. At the end of each week, you're going to give me a report on what you've read. 2 books sounded like a big assignment. Ben Carson, now a Republican presidential nominee, a candidate, later remembered, but he reconciled to the order. Since I've always loved animals, nature, and science, I chose library books on those topics. I began looking forward to my trips to the library, he said, in part because librarians came to know him and would tell him about new books. I thrived on this new way of life, and soon my interests widened to include books on adventure and scientific discoveries. By reading so much, my vocabulary automatically improved, along with my comprehension. In 1971, 10-year-old Barack Obama returned to Honolulu after living with his mother in Jakarta. First place I wanted to be was in a library, he later recalled. Often he had a specific information need. One Saturday, with the help of a raspy-voiced old librarian who appreciated my seriousness, I found a book on East Africa. Obama wanted information about Kenya, birthplace of his father, a Luo tribe member. The Luo raised cattle and lived in mud huts and ate cornmeal and yams and something called millet, the book said. Their traditional costume was a leather thong across the crotch. Shocked by what he read, Obama left the book open-faced on the table and walked out without thanking the librarian. All these people had information needs an American Public Library met, and the anecdotes I've read nicely fit into the library profession's traditional perspective that focuses primarily on information and translates into services librarians institute and maintain and collections, spaces, and resources they make accessible. For most of its history, librarianship has focused largely on what in the 18th century was called useful knowledge. In the 19th and 20th was called best reading, and for the librarians in the audience, that's still part of the American Library Association's motto, the best reading for the greatest cost, the best reading for, let me go over that again. The best reading for the greatest number at the least cost. There, I've got it, all right. And in the late 20th century has morphed into information. This focused term gives particular meaning to the phrase access to information that to this day dominates the profession's thinking. But the American Public Library is a unique civic institution because unlike most other civic institutions like courts and schools, people don't have to use it. As a result, over the generations, users heavily influence the process of shaping library collections and services. Librarianship doesn't address in any direct way this kind of bottom-up pressure, however, and for me was not comprehensive enough to explain what I was discovering about library as place and the transformative power of stories that users withdrew from libraries over the generations. So to explain my findings, my challenge became how to expand beyond the profession's traditional perspective, how to craft a framework that accommodated and explained the voices of library users I was uncovering in my research. To illustrate the importance of library's place, let me introduce you to Ricky. Now, I'm going to show you 3 excerpts of a forthcoming documentary being prepared by 2 San Francisco filmmakers on the American Public Library. They want to get it done by the time the Sundance Film Festival opens up in February of 2017. I encourage you to watch for it. It's called the Free for All Media Project. And these 2 filmmakers have constantly asked me if Ken Burns has approached me yet about doing it, because they can't figure out why Ken Burns hasn't done a documentary on the American Public Library. All right. So this is Ricky.
And I'm currently unemployed, but I do go to school. My this big, and I don't have any room for a desk, and so I come to the library to do my homework. But it's also just a great resource. I like to come to the gallery and see what shows they have going on. I come to lectures, I come and see films that they do. Mayoral debates, I've been here for a couple of those as well. Well, the reason that I'm here is because I think it's just important for people to understand. So when I first moved to San Francisco, I told you I went broke, and I was literally starving. And I had a place to live, but the library kept me warm, and it did. I'll get it together here in a second. There was a truck that came outside once a week, and I could go and get food there. And like I said, they had computers so that I could work on my resume and I could apply for jobs. And did I mention that it was warm here? So it's been there for me when I needed it. And it's a valuable resource. And oftentimes I think that people see the library as someplace for kids or someplace for homeless people. And there are just normal people like me that might need it as a resource. And I'm grateful that it's here.
And from my narrative, I quote a few more anecdotes. In the 1930s, at the Atlanta Public Library's African American branch, one of the few places in a segregated city where blacks felt safe and welcome, Director Annie Waters secured a grant to fund adult education programs, including discussion groups focused on Mahatma Gandhi. To ground these discussions, Waters purchased a number of books. Among their most devoted readers was a young Martin Luther King Jr., who came to the library many times during the week. She later recalled their interactions, which not only showed King's reading interest, but also manifested the value of library's place to Atlanta's black community. He would walk up to the desk and look me straight in the eye. "Hello, Martin Luther," she would respond, always calling him by his first and middle names. "What's on your mind?" "Oh, nothing particularly." For Waters, that was the cue that King had learned a new big word, and between them they then had a conversation in which King used the word repeatedly. Another game they played involved poetry. Again, King would stand by the desk waiting. "What's on your mind, Martin Luther?" Waters would ask. "For I dipped into the future, far as the human eye could see," he responded. Waters immediately recognized the poem and finished the verse. "For I dipped into the future, far as the human eye could see, saw a vision of the world and all the wonder that would be." The Gandhi collection presented a particular problem, however, because King was too young to check out these adult books on his children's card. To solve it, Waters told him, "Go ask your father to come and get a library card, and I'll check the books out on your father's card." That's how I made it possible for Martin Luther to read those books on Gandhi. And he read every one of those books we had. When the Cincinnati Public Library opened a piano room in 1955, among its first visitors was 12-year-old Jimmy Levine, as he wrote his name in pencil on the room's sign-up sheet. 8 visits later, he changed his signature to J. Levine and then James Levine. When he gave a concert for 150 children in the children's room in 1957, he'd already performed as a Cincinnati Symphony soloist. Today, he's the New York Mets artistic director. In 1969, the Gary, Indiana Public Library sponsored a local talent contest at which a group soon to be known as the Jackson 5 competed. Although they didn't win, Little Michael was an audience favorite. In 2005, the Washington Post carried an article by Eric Wee that focused on a District of Columbia branch library in one of Washington's poorest neighborhoods. In it, we reported that every Tuesday night, a homeless man named Conrad Cheek entered the library and set up his chessboard on one of the tables in the children's room. We immediately noticed the transformation taking place. "No more ignored pleas for this homeless man," we wrote. "No averted glances. During the next hour, people look him in the eye. They listen to his words. In this Down at the Heels library, he's the teacher." Among his students was 9-year-old Allie Osman. As we watched this interaction, Allie's mother explained that her son's confidence had soared after playing with Conrad. that he was now bragging to friends about being a chess player. "We owe it all to Mr. Conrad," his mother said. "We love him." Inside the library, we reported, they call him Mr. Conrad. Notice all these very meaningful experiences occurred in a place we call library. To categorize them as information gathering fails to capture their significance in the lives of each of these individuals. Now let me turn to the transformative potential of commonplace stories public libraries have circulated by the billions for generations. Meet Maria.
My birthday was yesterday and I am 95 years old. I started to use the library, I would consider 12, 13 years old, you know. Yes. I was born in St. Petersburg, Russia. We left and we started from scratch. And my English was zero, but their library was a couple of blocks away. And that's how it started. That library was everything to me. We couldn't afford to buy the books. Books were always expensive, and there were so many other needs. It was library, library, library all the time. And it didn't cost anything. Well, the library fills a certain place in my life, certain, to satisfy certain needs. I have seen a lot of very ugly things. And you just can't live all the time with bad. You have to balance it. And my balance was mostly to see something beautiful. And so I would go to the library and spend a couple of hours. But when I come out on the street, I'm a completely different person. It gave me such a relief, so as French would say, soulagement, you know.
And more from my narrative. In a 2008 interview, 88-year-old Pete Seeger recalled an early life reading experience. At age 7, a librarian recommended me a book about a teenager who runs away from his stepfather who's beating him and is adopted by a middle-aged Indian whose tribe was massacred, whose wife was sold into slavery and is living alone. That he remembered this so vividly 80 years later after reading it is testimony to the power of stories. And in Seeger's case, a New York Times editor noted upon his recent death, fitting for someone who went on to engage issues of conscience. In 1984, President Ronald Reagan wrote the daughter-in-law of Harold Bell Wright, whose best-selling 1920s religious novel, That Printer of Udell's, Reagan had read as an adolescent in Dixon, Illinois. Wright was no favorite of contemporary literary critics. H.L. Mencken called him a liberated yokel from the cow and hog states. Another critic was equally as harsh. Harold Bell Wright supplies more negative data on the literary quality of the taste of the fiction reading public than any other author. No matter to young Reagan, however. Shortly after reading the book, he declared himself saved and was baptized. The novel's protagonist, Reagan wrote Wright's daughter-in-law 60 years later, served as a role model that shaped his life ever since. It's highly likely the copy of That Printer of Udell's Reagan read came from the Dixon Public Library, which he visited twice a week in the early 1920s, mostly to check out Frank Merriwell and Sherlock Holmes stories, Tarzan novels, and books by Horatio Alger, Zane Grey, and Mark Twain, many of which he read on the library's front steps. I'm a sucker for hero worship, he later admitted. For Oprah Winfrey, reading commonplace stories was an open door to freedom in my life, and it allowed me to see that there was a world beyond my grandmother's front porch in Mississippi, that everybody didn't have an outhouse, that everybody wasn't surrounded by poverty, that there was a hopeful world out there, and it could belong to me. To Winfrey, the stories became her comfort, her solace to commune with and learn something about myself, to learn something about other people, to learn something about the world. In a small Milwaukee apartment as a 9-year-old in 1963, she read a public library copy of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, her first all-night book, the story of Francie Nolan, whose life was full of humiliation and whose only friends were in books lining the public library shelves. I felt like my life was hers. After her father died in 1963, 9-year-old Sonia Sotomayor buried herself in reading at her Bronx library in the apartment she shared with her mother and her brother. Nancy Drew had a powerful hold on my imagination, she remembered. Every night when I'd finished reading and got into bed and closed my eyes, I'd continue the story with me in Nancy's shoes until I fell asleep. Her mind, she noted, worked in ways very similar to Nancy's. I was a keen observer and listener. I picked up on cues. I figured things out logically, and I enjoyed puzzles. I loved the clear, focused feeling that came when I concentrated on solving a problem and everything else faded out. Reading that summer, she admitted, was her solace and only distraction that got her through this time of trouble. All these anecdotes point to the power of printed commonplace stories and to change people's lives. But stories reside in all cultural media. If you watch television, go to the movies, read popular magazines, and look at advertisements, argues Richard Keller Simon, you're exposed to many of the same kinds of stories as someone who studies the great books of Western civilization. You've simply been encouraged to look at them differently. Stories, Richard Nash argues, constitute recipes for the imagination. Media scholar Henry Jenkins adds, stories are basic to all human cultures, the primary means by which we structure, share, and make sense of our common experiences. Meet Danny.
One of the things that, say, the library offered me was that it was a place where I could actually absorb American pop culture. I grew up in an immigrant household, so I was, like, the library for me was always the place where I could get free media. When I was a teenager, I was, like, really big into, like, punk rock culture in the music scene, and I couldn't afford records, so I was always going to the library, whereas my friends were able to either buy their records with their parents' money or worse yet, steal it. I would always go to the library and check them out. When I was a teenager, I think I might have been like 15 years old, I had heard about a film called A Beautiful Thing, which is based on a play, and it's a gay film. I remember going to the library and looking up in the catalog and like making sure that nobody saw me, and I went to the stacks, I found it, I kind of hid it underneath like a stack of books, like sandwiched between a stack of books, and I checked it out. Took this video home, I had to hide it from my parents, and I remember watching this film, and it was so powerful to me. It was a love story between two young British teenagers, and for me, it dropped a certain angle down where, on an emotional level, I didn't feel like I was floundering somehow. So that felt really good. And I remember playing that cassette tape, that VHS tape, over and over and over again late at night when everyone in my house was sleeping. I would sneak out to the living room and I would play this video that I had borrowed from the library, like at least once a night for 3 weeks in a row, sometimes repeating certain scenes over and over again, just because for me they really stuck to me. And I would renew it.
That public libraries have always played a primary role in making stories accessible to millions of users is obvious. Ever since the Boston Public Library opened in 1854, fiction, a particular form of story, consistently averaged 66 to 75% of public library circulation. By force of demand, then, every generation of public library users has insisted on a set of stories acceptable to a majority of community members that contained messages they wanted to read, hear, and view. The latest public library circulation statistics I'll detail in a minute show they still do. My historical research clearly demonstrates the capacity of commonplace stories to stimulate reader imagination, construct community through shared meaning, and demonstrate moral achievement. In the free will act of reading, readers move into and out of a text and thus appropriate meaning relevant to their own lives. Because readers can control it, the act of reading stories becomes dependably pleasurable, empowering, intellectually stimulating, and socially bonding. And it's in the act of reading stories that social and cultural acts of defiance take place. If expert communities lack the power to check voluntary reading for interpretations they find acceptable, ordinary readers construct their own meanings, sometimes as groups, sometimes as individuals. Most often, public libraries have done a very good job of democratizing their spaces and supplying information and stories. Sometimes they haven't, however. I show you here a picture of two beefy white cops taking a skinny African-American teenage girl out of the Albany, Georgia Carnegie Library in July of 1963. Her transgression, reading a book at the table. And although in 1963 most American public libraries had Nancy Drew on their shelves, the New York Public Library did not. There, librarians considered series fiction trash. Instead, Sonia Sotomayor got her copies of Nancy from her mother for good behavior. The New York Public Library didn't drop the ban on Nancy until 1976. My own very liberal San Francisco Public Library didn't drop the ban until 1996. And pulp paperback titles from the 1950s and 1960s that many gays and lesbians read voraciously and considered survival literature were never reviewed in library publications or acquired by public libraries. What public libraries often gave them instead was misinformation. Because she believed libraries are the place where we can be most anonymous and delve deeply into areas we wish to uncover in secret, one 15-year-old later recalled, it was to the library I turned in 1969 to uncover the meaning of my lesbianism, and what I found was not echoic of my own experience. Rather, the information she found there frightened me and convinced me that this was not lesbian I was experiencing, but something else. Remember back in the 1980s when many evangelists of information technology predicted the demise of public libraries by the turn of the century? They were wrong, dead wrong. In 2012, latest year for which we have statistics, the U.S. has more public libraries than ever, 17,219, including branches and bookmobiles. That's over 3,000 more than the number of McDonald's restaurants in this country. That usually gets an applause line, especially from the librarians. While the number of visits declined slightly in 2012 from 1.52 to 1.5 billion, remember that the recession forced libraries to reduce their hours of opening by about 2%, and more people were checking library books out as e-books from their computers at home, the decade nonetheless showed a 21% increase. That same year, 93 million Americans attended a public library program, an 8-year increase of 38%. 65 million attendees were children, a 24% increase from the previous decade. In 2012, public libraries circulated 2.2 billion items, which include audio and video materials and e-books, a 28% increase from 2003. Circulation per capita showed a 10-year increase of 17%. Public libraries also provided users with access to 250,000 internet-ready computers, 100% more per capita than a decade earlier. For generations now, library and government officials have argued that the public library's most important role is to provide access to useful information that develops intelligent consumers, creative entrepreneurs, and informed citizens, the kind of information Thomas Edison and Ben Carson pursued in their public libraries that many argue people can now retrieve on their computers at home. Public library users, however, show a different set of priorities. For them, the tens of thousands of spaces public libraries provide for many purposes and the billions of commonplace stories they circulate in a variety of textual forms are at least as important as, for most even more important than, access to information, and for a variety of reasons. In her book, The Village Effect, How Face-to-Face Contact Can Make Us Healthier, Happier, and Smarter, Susan Pinker harnesses research in the fast-developing field of social neuroscience to demonstrate that substantial benefits accrue to those who experience high levels of face-to-face contact, including improved vocabularies, an increased ability to empathize, a deeper sense of belonging, and perhaps more important, a longer lifespan. Neuroscientific research that focuses specifically on the social nature of commonplace reading comes to similar conclusions. Fiction, notes research psychologist Keith Oatley, is a particularly useful simulation because negotiating the social world effectively is extremely tricky, requiring us to weigh up myriad interacting instances of cause and effect. Just as computer simulations can help us get to grips with complex scientific problems, so novels, stories, and dramas can help us understand the complexities of social life. As I pondered these conclusions from the field of social neuroscience, I wondered if the face-to-face contact American public libraries make possible in so many ways enables users to live longer, happier, and healthier lives than non-users. That is a researchable question my profession has never undertaken. And if they do, why? Answering that question requires librarianship to expand way beyond its traditional focus on information access in order to explore the community building and personal benefits of public libraries' place and the sociability that reading, viewing, and listening fosters. For generations now, adolescent series fiction and adult Western, romance, horror, mystery, and science fiction novels have driven public library circulation. They still do. Through commonplace stories like these that they circulate by the billions, American public libraries have helped empower, inform, intellectually stimulate, and inspire their readers, viewers, and listeners, just like they did for Pete Seeger, Ronald Reagan, Oprah Winfrey, and Sonia Sotomayor. And through the tens of thousands of spaces they make available to their patrons, they have helped construct community in multiple positive ways through the billions of face-to-face encounters they nurture, just like they did for Martin Luther King Jr. and Conrad Cheek. In my lifetime of research into American library history, I've read thousands of statements like these. Public libraries are not just warehouses of books anymore. If part of our lives accurately represents public library history, they never were. Instead, for the past century and a half, here in Milwaukee as elsewhere, they've been public places of performance where users displayed moral progress and achievement. They've also operated as a robust commons where members of the public discussed a variety of issues that concerned them. They functioned as centripetal forces to craft a sense of community among disparate populations and evolve community trust between its multicultural elements. They've acted as key players in constructing group identity through the stories and places they provided. And they've started neighborhood conversations, welcomed the recently arrived into their midst, and served as community anchors. Access to information, library's place, and the transformative potential of reading commonplace stories. I hope conclusions I've drawn from my historical research have persuaded you to broaden your thinking about libraries in general and public libraries in particular. The naysayers largely ignorant of this library history are still with us. It's all on the internet, hype many evangelists of information technology. Libraries are dinosaurs, grouse officials looking to cut budgets. To combat this limited thinking, we have to reach beyond librarianship's traditional perspective on information access to include, from a user's perspective, deeper analysis of library place and reading. Now, I'm going to show you two slides that, for me, represent what this means. This is a slide of the lobby of the Toledo Lucas County Public Library the night that a Harry Potter novel was released. And examine, if you will, the diversity that's represented in that audience. Age, gender, race, ethnicity, etc. And explore in the back of your mind what this means for the community. Okay, that's library as place, which is nicely wrapped up into the concept of the sociability of reading. And here's your awe moment. This is my son Andy with my grandson Teague. Teague is fully capable of reading the book that he just pulled from the public library, but he chose it for the subject interest he shares with his dad. Now, I would argue there's a case to be made that this simple dynamic has more to do with the increase in literacy rates than the mechanics of formal education, No Child Left Behind, and Common Core. We haven't done enough research to examine that particular question. By doing so, my historical research demonstrates we can document hundreds, if not thousands more ways these incubators of personal happiness and informal self-education contribute to the daily lives of public library patrons as individuals and as members of their community, and we can show much more clearly how they function as active and effective agents in the construction of that very community. Thank you very much.
So we have a good 15 minutes or so for questions, and for those of you who are veterans of the appellate courtroom and are seated in the front half of the room, you know that what you need to do is to raise your hand, and then when you're recognized, to press down and hold down on the rim of the little thing that's in front of you, not the ball itself, but the rim. For those of you who are in the back, Ryan Rao has a microphone, and if you can wait for him to bring it to you to ask your question. So with apologies for taking over the podium, but only for the briefest moment, can we go ahead and get some questions? Yes. Ryan, can you bring the microphone back there?
You don't have to apologize, Joe. You signed my wife's check for a number of years.
Thank you very much for your talk. Have there been other times in history where the public library has been perceived as irrelevant?
Constantly. Yeah. Public libraries suffer along with all civic institutions in economic downturn times. And then people will ask, do we really need to support them? The irony is, in the economic bad times, that's when they're needed most, because the usage goes up. Great Depression, for example, usage went up by 30-some%. And stories coming out of the Great Depression of individuals who were able to rescue their economic plight by harnessing things that were in the library are very numerous. I love to put them in the book. So yes, they are, I think, probably public libraries will be under constant pressure, as they were in the past, in the future, to justify their existence. I would like to see us open our arena of thinking to embrace all of the things public libraries do so that we can bring research to bear on the evidence that historically proves to me they're much more important than we previously thought they were.
So the Carnegie libraries, we see them all over the United States. They kind of seem like I guess you could say, the Apollo Moon project of libraries. Do you feel like we need another one? And what impact have those Carnegie libraries had before and after?
Yeah, okay. Now, forgive me, I'm going to give you a few more sentences than the question called for, because this is a teaching moment. Okay. It was the Carnegie Library that really kicked the public library movement into gear. When he started giving money for buildings in the 1890s, by the time he stopped giving money for buildings shortly after World War I, a community without a library was considered not acceptable. The library was a symbol of cultural, how the community valued culture. But I want to tell you a little bit about the Carnegie Library, because it rolls into libraries' place so well. Communities like Milwaukee, like my hometown of Manitowoc, would write letters to Carnegie because they heard he was given money for buildings, library buildings. And he would respond according to a formula. Your community's got so many population, et cetera, so you could benefit from a grant of so much. And then they would write back saying, but we never built a library before. What do you recommend? So Carnegie's minions got together and they identified 6 building plans to accord with the size of the grant that they were getting. Now those 6 building plans were widely adopted, and that's why Carnegie libraries look so similar. Every single one of those building plans had a community room designed into it. Now the librarians did such a great job of amassing collections, they pushed the collections into the community room. And for 2 generations, we librarians forgot what that original room was designed for. Can't remember them, Paula, where's Paula? There must have been a community room in the public library at the original Milwaukee building. Was there? Okay, all right. So at any rate, the Carnegie intended for the library to be a place for the community to gather. And the librarians then practiced their profession so well, they kind of moved away from that. Now, come the Great Society programs of the Lyndon Johnson era, there were a lot more funds that librarians were very skillful in tapping, and that was the second movement to increase the number of public libraries. You see bookmobiles going all over the place, new additions to buildings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But by that time, the library was perceived as an essential service in the cultural horizon. Those Great Society programs, however, came back and paid for some of the services that had come out of the late 19th, early 20th century community room. So that pattern is there, but the connection to the history wasn't perceived. No, we do not need another Carnegie, I don't think. Bill Gates was really good for putting computers in libraries, but I think at this point, communities will support their libraries well into the future. They won't support them as well as librarians would like, and some of you, I'm sure, but they will support them. Nobody's going to kill a library. When that happens, it's on the front page of the New York Times.
I wonder if you can, based on your academic career, if you can talk about the implications of some of the things that you've talked about in terms of the roles that libraries play for the way that librarians are trained, have been trained in the past, and maybe will be trained in the future. It just seems like such a diverse set of skills are implied by some of the things that you
I come out of oh, yes. Correct me if I'm wrong about your question. The issue of education for library professionals right now, does it match some of the stuff I'm talking about here? And I'm a library educator of some 35 years. And I have watched in the 1980s programs that educate students to become professional librarians chase information technology. And that's where the money is. And pressure is being brought to bear on university personnel to go after that money. So I understand it. However, I believe at this point, library education is probably more distant from library practice. Their professional, it's coming, is more distant from professional practice than any other profession. That's it. And not the reason, I love doing this historical research. A reason I undertook this was to make a point.
Please.
Then the question is your next book going to be talking about that issue?
I have 2 books in the works. First one, Cheryl and I are doing a book on the desegregation of public libraries in the American South. That's pretty much done. But my last project on my bucket list is a history of the American public school library, in which I take this, theoretical frame I established for this and apply it to that history. I see across the country states, localities literally killing their school libraries without understanding that, pick this one right here, without understanding what's going on there and without understanding what's, whoops, I don't know what I'll remember the Toledo-Lucas County thing. I think library is place. Maybe that's a secret garden for kids in schools that get a little tired of the formal rigor that they have to go through. I'd like to explore that. But I got to generate the data for it. So that's my next book. It's out there. The book's out there. It's got ideas. I wish my profession will engage in a conversation about those ideas, and I'll be happy to respond. Thank you.
In the back row to the left there, please. Yes.
Consuelo Hernandez, currently of Milwaukee Public Library, but formerly of Toledo-Lucas County Public Library for 20 years. And I was looking for myself in that Harry Potter, because I was there at that opening. But my question is, can you talk a little bit about different funding models? I'm very proud of the funding model in Ohio and at the Toledo-Lucas County Public Library, and was a bit disappointed when I came to Milwaukee Public Library based on our funding model and per capita that we spend in different areas. So my question is different funding models, and how do people, just if you could comment on that, please. And thank you very much.
I'm an airhead reeking of archives dust, and I'm probably as poorly positioned to talk about funding models. I can tell you that the governance structure instituted by the Boston Public Library in 1854 is still pretty much with us. I can also tell you that 80 to 85% of funding for public libraries nationwide comes from local real estate taxes. It's that 15 to 20% that you've got federal and state funds coming in. But as for funding structures, I'm pretty ignorant about that.
Do you see me in the background there?
Are you in there?
Very attractive young lady in the back there.
Was that a stroke of good fortune or what? Yeah, I recognize you.
Thank you very much.
Other questions? Yes.
Could you comment a little more on the history of library governance? How do we govern our libraries?
Local trustees. Okay, some of them are elected, some of them are appointed. But the fact that it's local trustees, it's resist the forces of federalism, and it's kept libraries close to their communities. I argue that's a strength. That's not a weakness. There are a lot of people who would say that's a weakness because it allows localities to control the cultural parameters in which libraries operate. I think they have to live in the cultural parameters of their locality. Should they go too far? Back in the late 19th century, public libraries developed what they called an inferno. That was the professional jargon where controversial books would be parked. And in order to get a controversial book, you had to apply to the librarian, prove that you were of moral character and capable of handling such a thing as Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. And we've carried that to the present. Now we call them permission shelves, etc. But that is a solution to the controversy between people who don't want that book available, primarily for their kids, and people who believe it should be available. So I think the library has actually come upon an age-tested solution to having materials accessible to more members of their community than some of those members would like.
Certainly. So you mentioned that professional practice in education is chasing information technology, but I see the design of actual physical new libraries are integrating cafes and information commons and facilitating this face-to-face contact between people. Do you believe the built environment is closing that gap that you see in professional practice?
What do you mean by the built environment?
The built environment, as in the actual physical library itself, as a building, instead of librarianship as a profession.
Well, let me take you back into the 17th and the 18th century, where the first libraries in this country opened up in coffee houses and millinery shops. Now, the latter was because women wanted access to the explosion of new novels that were coming out, and they weren't permitted to have access to all places, especially those that were serving alcohol. So we've just caught up to a tradition in librarianship by instituting cafes, the Torrey Hill Cafe out here where I had breakfast this morning. So I welcome this as it's not a development, it's recapturing a tradition, as I see it. There is no holy book in which God tells us what a library should be. Now, the Benedictines think they know, but I would hope the Jesuits would argue with them, especially on this campus. But there is no holy book in which God tells us what a library should be. People make libraries, and they should make them to meet community needs. If history is any teacher, the most successful are the ones that meet the community needs best.
Other questions? We have a couple more minutes. Yes, can you hold the room down as you ask the question, please? Or maybe your neighbor can. It's not on yet. Thank you. Yes, hold that down.
Okay. I would just like to point out that the Milwaukee Public Library does have a community room. The Centennial Hall complex is the birthplace of early music now, which, because of Don Sager's insight, allowed us to present our first concerts there, and we have now become one of the most respected early music presenters in the world.
Now, if only we had a history of the value that room has for the Milwaukee community, we could then match it against the access to information the Milwaukee Public Library has provided for these many years.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions. Yes, if you can wait for the microphone to come back to you, we will buy the time here. Let me take the opportunity to say that I'm impressed by Wayne's statement that he knows what the Benedictines are thinking. I was always told that no one knows. There are three things that are so mysterious they're not even known to God. What the Benedictines are thinking, what the Jesuits are doing, and how many orders of nuns there are. That was not set up. Go ahead.
That was not what my question was about. I'm also from the Milwaukee Public Library, and honestly, I have two questions, and admittedly, I did not have an opportunity to read your book in full, though I'd still like to. So maybe you could pick one of the two to answer. First, your comment about if we closed libraries, that it would be on the cover of the New York Times is likely true, but how come stories about the library and the success we have today never make the cover? So that to me is always interesting and a challenge. And then the second one is our board president had shared recently that the school board has always had a position on our board. And I think that school relationships with libraries have been fragmented at best. So I'm interested if you know more about that in the history of libraries.
Yeah, let me address the second question first. Look for the next book. In the past, in this city particularly, I don't know if I'm taking some of your thunder, John. In this city, John's going to speak a little bit about the Milwaukee Public Library history, and we shared some information prior to the program. In this city, the Milwaukee Public Librarians provided a model for the rest of the country in cooperation with local public and parochial schools back in the first 2-3 decades of the 20th century. That was followed then by the educators taking over library services within the schools. And in the wake of all that, of course, you've got professionalism claiming turf, and arguments and unions coming in. I'm not arguing against unions. Please don't throw tomatoes at me or anything. But there are vested interests that then get created that are passed down to the year 2015. I need to explore more the relationships between those two before I feel comfortable in answering your question. And now I've forgotten your first question. Sorry.
So I think we're going to conclude with Professor Wiegand's presentation. That is our plan. Let me say a couple of things. First, that was really terrific, and I am immensely grateful that you would come out here for this. Second, we are not taking a break right now. We are going to go directly into the second presentation, which should go for about 20 minutes, and so we'll have a break after that, and I'll introduce that presentation in a moment. Third, with respect to those of you who have not had an opportunity to read Professor Wiegand's book, he has brought with him the remaining copies from his tour of Wisconsin and other points, and I want to say that you have about 10 or so with you, and he is eager not to bring them back to California with him. So for the appropriate modest fee, whatever that is that you negotiate with him, you are welcome to purchase one of those by cash or check, and so that would be not only in your interest in terms of learning things, but in Professor Wiegand's in terms of not having to carry them back. And fourth, I want to introduce our next speaker, who is well known to so many of you who attend our programs. This is Charles Franklin, who is Professor of Law and Public Policy here at Marquette University Law School and Director of the Marquette Law School Poll. He has been with us for the past several years on a full-time basis. Previously, he was Professor of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and previous to that at Washington University. He is, by profession, an extraordinary political scientist with a first-rate reputation among academics, but he is much more popularly known these days as the director of the Marquette Law School Poll. His track record thus far is unerring, and given that we are in an odd-numbered year, he won't be proved wrong anytime soon. It's only the even-numbered years that we sweat a little bit, and so you will have no way of disproving the information that he is about to present concerning the American Public Library. Charles?
I'll also take just 1 second to say I come from a little town of 3,000 people and one Carnegie library and a librarian named Mrs. Ike who mattered a lot. So we were in the field in September with this survey. It's a little over 800 respondents statewide, and I won't bore you with the rest of the technical details. But we took the opportunity, knowing this was coming, and for the purposes of the survey, that while we do the horse race, and that gets the lead usually in the stories, we constantly poll about public issues and things that are not part of the campaign. And so in this case, public libraries was a great opportunity. I'm going to mention how many people use the library, how accessible it is to them, what they do when they're there, and then close with evidence about how much support there is and where there is limited support. And that, I think, fits well with some of the points that came up in the discussion in the Q&A. So this is the first question on accessibility. How far away is the library from you? Now remember, this is a statewide survey, so this includes the entire state. And 26% say that they can walk to their local public library. Another 57% say that it's less than a 15-minute ride. That could be car, it could be bus, but they have to get in a vehicle to get there, but it's still a 15-minute journey. Those two together then put us at about 80% of the public that can get to a library in 15 minutes or less, walking or riding. But then there's another 15% for whom it's more than a 15-minute ride, and for 5% it's more than a 30-minute ride. Where do those folks live? Well, hardly surprising that in urban areas over on the left, you have in the green bar the most number of people that can just walk to their library. That drops off as you go to suburban areas and rural areas. But what you also see is that suburbs compensate for the walk by more 15-minute or less drives. So those first two bars together are actually about the same whether you're in an urban or a suburban area. It's about 15 minutes or less away, though the mode that you take to get there is more riding in the suburbs and more walking in the cities. It's the rural areas where we see the right two bars, the orange and yellow bars, tick up a little bit, where it's more than a 15-minute journey. and there you see a little bit of a difference. Though even so, those first two bars are a fairly impressive testament of how 15-minute access to a library is pretty close to universal throughout the state, with a little bit more of a challenge in rural areas. What about use of the library? And so the question we asked here, have you ever used a public library? And if yes, have you used one in the last 12 months? Here we get 56% active users who have been to the library or used a bookmobile as another option in the last year. 24% have used a library but haven't been there in 12 months or more. And finally, 20% say they've never used a public library. This is in the ballpark of the results of the Pew National Surveys of library usage as well. And so we look pretty close to where the nation as a whole is on usage. Well, who uses them? And here, the usage level, that green bar, the active users, is almost the same whether you live in an urban, a suburban, or a rural area. There's a slight drop-off in the rural areas, but it's not very much, and given the sample sizes, I don't think we would reliably say usage is less in the rural areas, though as you saw, access is a little bit less, so it wouldn't be surprising if it's slightly lower. What about the kinds of people that come and use the library? And here, age makes a difference in an interesting sort of curve shape. It rises with age as we go from the 20s into the 30s and 40s, but then drops off among those 60 and over. You might think a little bit about whether this makes sense, but this is what the data show. A priori, I might have thought that school-age people would be the most likely to have recent experience with libraries. That's not quite true, but it rises over time. And then there's this drop-off at the end. Also, look at the orange bar there, the never used bar, which falls with age but then rises in the 60-plus category. And that suggests actually a generational difference rather than an aging effect. Because after all, if you've ever used the public library, you have more and more chance as you get older and older. So if it was just an aging effect, we'd think those 60 and over would actually be the least likely to have never used a library because they've had more time to encounter one. So I think the rise there at the end suggests that among our older population, and remember this is an open-ended category, right? 60 plus is on average about 72 in our data. So there may be some generational differences in use of library here. And it could also be some other things, but that's at least a suggestion that we get a life course rise, but then some generational difference at the end. The other thing that matters a lot is whether you have kids. And if you have kids at home, the right group of bars, you see there's about a 10% boost in active use of the library. That, I think, is pretty obviously intuitive. In a minute, I'll show you more reason to believe that. But it's not a 30% boost, in part because there's already a pretty high level of usage. Over 50% of those without children in the household are already active users of the library. So adding children in the home boosts that to a bit over 60%. But it already starts from a large base. It's not going from 20% to 60%. It's going from 52 to 62%. What about education? And here is one of the more difficult issues to think about. For those in our sample with a high school education or less, active usage is the lowest at about 40%, rises to just over 55% for those with some college but not a degree, and peaks out at 70% for those with a bachelor's degree or greater. And this flies a little bit in the face of the narrative that it is the most disadvantaged for whom the libraries are the most important. But it doesn't directly speak to that either. It's entirely possible that the library is having its biggest effect on those with the least advantage. But simultaneously, those with the least advantage are also the least likely to be able or to take advantage of the library. So there's a gap here between the sense of the importance in people's lives, to which I cannot speak from these data, versus the frequency of usage. If you look at just frequency of usage, though, you see that libraries are providing whatever advantages they do disproportionately to those who already are advantaged. And in this sense, it is reinforcing advantage rather than having the effect of providing more resources to the less advantaged. And again, I stress that the impact it has on people's lives is not addressed by this. But in terms of the pattern of usage, it's clearly those who are better off who are making the biggest use of the library. Goodness, it would be nice to know what that is, because the top is cut off. Ryan, where are you? Help me, help me, help me. I know there's some magic that shrinks the slide so that the top caption is visible. Well, knowing it's among active users doesn't help very much. I can tell you. More or less, I can tell you. Usually, you know, when you make a plea to Ryan like that, magic just happens. So, sorry. This is why I came prepared. So anyway, this question is, we're now in a series of how people use the library, and this particular question is, have you borrowed a book in the last year? Now, this is only of the 56% who are active users, right? Because it makes no sense to ask it of non-active users. But you see, 72%, this is, and we're going in order here, so this is the highest single category of usage. Despite everything we hear about electronic books and about internet access and about comfy cafes, nevertheless, the number one usage is to go and borrow a printed book. Okay? It's 72%. The next category is, have you taken a child to the library in the last year? And this is 49%. Half of active users have. But let me remind you that half of active users don't have kids at home. So this is a very high percentage of people with kids at home, though, granted, grandparents might be taking kids and so on. But still, the attractiveness of the library as a place for children to go and look at books, read books, go to activities, and so on, is very clear in our data. How about just sitting and reading? 43% say they've done that. That's where those cafes, and I would lobby as much as I possibly could for more comfy chairs, please. Those straightbacks just don't do it for me anymore. But comfy chairs and coffee and sit and read, very popular. 43% have just gone to do that. Now we get a little bit lower in the usage, but still fairly high. More than a third have gone to get help from a librarian of some sort. We didn't probe whether that was help for a research project or a term paper or help finding an IRS form. All of these are just a few of the many things that people get help from librarians. But about a third, a little over a third, are going for that purpose. Here's the much talked about, but as you see from the data, not as impressive, use of the internet. 27% have gone to use a computer or the internet. One thing that I'm not going to talk about today, but we cover in our survey, is people's access to the internet and use of it at home. And there we see that of those who use the internet at all, access is a surprisingly small issue. A little bit more in rural areas where high-speed internet still hasn't penetrated, but on a percentage basis, that's a small share of the public. Still, 1 in 4 say that they have gone to the library to use either the computers or the internet access that's provided. And about the same number, 25%, have come for a meeting or a class that was held at the library. Just this past weekend, I went to the Madison Public Library where David Marinis was talking about his new book, and I thought I was doing well by arriving 15 minutes early, only to discover the overflow room was full, and I had to sit far away. A good example of going to a meeting, going to a public event, and finding the room quite packed. Now, so those are the ways that people use the library. It still, in some ways, looks like your granddaddy's library, going to get a book, going to sit and read, taking your child there. But with aspects of the modern era as well, using a computer, getting internet access, and so on. So it's a mix of these things, no one of which is vanishingly small, and no one of which is absolutely dominant, though I think you could probably claim some dominance for the book borrowing. The last thing to mention there is, of course, some of these folks borrow more than one book. And so when you think of weighting the data by the circulation that people contribute to the use of libraries, that's another more complicated issue. Obviously, the number of items accessed is vastly different than the number of people who are active users, and varies a lot, but we're not going into that. One of the issues that Wayne raised and that some of your questions raised is the issue of public support for libraries in an era of budget constraints, though I believe those constraints have always been there in one form or another. Where do people feel about that? So this is the question about the impact of closing the library on you and your family. And we're now asking this of all respondents, not just the active users, because after all, when you think of public support, the non-users are part of that public as well and might have opinions somewhat different from active users. Only 37% say closing their local library would have a major impact on them and their family. Another 40% say it would have a minor impact, and a quarter, 23%, say it'd have no effect on them at all. And so somewhere between that 37 major and the 20%, 23% none, is room for a significant political uncertainty about support and the importance, even though, remember, 56% are active users, only 37% of the total public say it would have a major impact. So that implies directly that there are quite a few active users who don't think it would really matter that much, at least not as a major issue. But what about the impact on your community? And here, the major impact jumps up to 68%. So this is a very interesting result where the purely self-interested aspect of the library closing is not trivial at 37%, but it's not overwhelming. But the perception that it would matter to the community as a whole is overwhelming at over 2/3. So I think this is a very interesting and striking difference of concern for a community value that's much higher than the concern for the personal self-interest. If you look at it, now this is the impact by active users for personal impact. If you're an active user, half say it would have a major impact. Still, that's only half of active users. And then you see it drops down under 20% for the other two classes of users. But look at what happens when we move to the community impact. Among the active users, it's up to 80% saying a major impact on the community, but maybe more importantly, among the non-active users or the never users, half say it would have a major impact on the community. So this is quite a gap between the self-interest and the community interest, and it's fairly unusual in the data that I tend to look at. If we look at would people organize in your community to respond to a closing of the library, 52% say it's very likely that their neighbors would organized to resist that, another 32% likely. But look at what happens when we look at it by active users again. And again, you see it's a little bit higher for the active users, but it's nearly as high for the inactive and non-users. Again, suggesting that the perception of the importance of community action would be higher in that case. So, substantial usage, the kinds of usage patterns that ranges from print to internet, and support, but not necessarily pure self-interest. That's the situation we're in with public opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Am I correct that the underlying numbers are all up on our website, the law.marquette.edu/poll, and if you go to the results column or tab, you will find the most recent Marquette Law School poll, which includes the module of a dozen or so questions on the basis of which Charles presented those data. Thank you very much.
Welcome back. I want to thank Dean Joe Kearney. My name is David Haynes. I'm the editorial page editor at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. And I also want to thank Marquette University Law School generally for the opportunity to collaborate over these past few years. It's really been an honor to extend what we do in helping to create community conversations out into the community through the law school. So now a word about John Gerda, my friend and colleague. When we think about Milwaukee's long and colorful history, I think we naturally think of one name, and that's John Gerda. That's because for many years, John is the person who has helped us understand that history through his many books and through a column that he's published in our newspaper for more than 20 years now. John's a Milwaukee native, and he's been studying his hometown since 1972. He's the author of more than 20 books about Milwaukee, including The Making of Milwaukee, and his newest effort, Milwaukee City of Neighborhoods, and I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful book. It's richly illustrated and beautifully written. You know, John walked or biked every neighborhood in Milwaukee to do research for that book, and I think that's just indicative of the care that he takes in the work that he does. John's written in his career about everything from life insurance to Frank Lloyd Wright. In addition to his work as a writer, John is a lecturer and tour guide, and he's won the Wisconsin Historical Society's Award of Merit 8 times. So if past is prologue, then we have to understand our history to understand our present. And because of John's thoughtful, well-researched, and highly readable histories, we in Milwaukee have a much clearer understanding of who we are. Please welcome John Gerda.
Thank you, David, and a pleasure to be here this morning. The first place I was allowed to go entirely on my own was a public library, without holding some adult's hand. I spent my early years in Milwaukee on South 34th Street, not far from Jackson Park on the south side. By the age of 5, perhaps 6, my parents allowed me to walk all the way from our little post-war prefab on 34th Street to the Leighton Park Branch Library at 2913 West Forest Home Avenue. The route took me past a bathtub factory, over a footbridge across the Northwestern Railroad tracks, past Gilbert and Eileen's Tavern with a little wishing well outside, and finally to this cramped storefront library. The journey covered more than a half mile uphill both ways. And I made it so often that my PF flyers must have worn grooves in the sidewalk between home and library. This was back in the 1950s, a time that was either less fearful or genuinely safer than our own. Hard to imagine that kind of permission being granted today. I recall the Leighton Park branch as kind of a narrow, fairly Spartan space, dark in back and light in front, but it had all I needed. I plowed through stacks of easy readers and more challenging fare to remain a member in good standing of the Billy the Bookworm Club. Any other former members here? Still have your cards? I don't either. Even before I had outgrown Billy, my family had moved with a lot of other Southsiders out to Hales Corners, and the Leighton Park branch had moved up the street down Forstham Avenue to around 43rd to another cramped storefront. And that remained my library through grade school and well into high school. It was there that I discovered entirely on my own remembered books fondly like The Education of Hyman Kaplan, The Kid Who Batted 1000, Kit Carson Frontiersman, and the slightly wicked short stories of Roald Dahl. In those days before digital self-checkout, you all recall that, you had to write your card number on a slip tucked inside the envelope inside the front cover of the book. And I use my card so often that I will go to my grave remembering 5413940. As an adult, my focus shifted to the Central Library. I've earned my living as a freelance historian for more than 40 years now, and no resources have mattered more to me than Central Library, especially the collections of the Frank P. Zeidler Humanities Room. And I've been following in his footsteps, David. No one has ever known more about Milwaukee history than him. Without those collections, and without the librarians who keep them organized and accessible, I might be selling life insurance or teaching high school history. Nothing wrong with those professions, but I'd rather do what I've been doing for all these years. Hey, I tell the story of my library, not because it's unique, but precisely because it is not. Many of us, I suspect most of us, have stories of my library, a strongly personal connection with a broadly public institution. We look back on the friendly librarian of our youth, or perhaps the grumpy one. We look ahead to the next book, the next DVD, the next program. We recall the dizzying feeling as kids that all this was ours for the borrowing, all these riches. And we look ahead to the next program, next DVD, the next book, and take for granted that it always will be available to us. When you think about it, the public library functions as a sort of curated internet. Without the dross, without the ads, without the anarchy. It's an open door to the gathered wealth of our civilization and the cultural output of Western culture for everyone and for free. That makes it one of the greatest and most democratic institutions on the planet. In Milwaukee's case, the institution took form in the city's infancy. Back in 1847, which is just 1 year after Milwaukee became a city, a group of Yankee pioneers decided to begin a lending library, as Wayne calls them, a social library. It was no coincidence in those pre-railroad times that they organized in December, after winter had closed the shipping lanes and put Milwaukee literally on ice until the following spring. They were starved for books, so they resolved to raise $1,000 before the opening of navigation, as they put it, to make sure that the works of Edgar Allan Poe and Ralph Waldo Emerson were in the hold of the first ships coming west from Buffalo, New York. The group called itself the Young Men's Association, and the founders' names may still be familiar. Luminaries like Rufus King, Edward Alice, and the incomparable Increase Lapham. So-called regular members paid a $2 initiation fee, and graybeards over 35 shelled out $5, and that's about $150 in today's currency. So this was an investment. What they received for that sum, plus $2 in annual dues, was unlimited access to a small but growing collection of books. Members could check out one large book or two small ones for a period of 2 weeks with a 1-week renewal privilege. They were either faster readers than we are, or they had more time on their hands. Today it's a 3-week blending period for books and 2 renewals. They used income from initiation fees and dues and a lecture series that brought luminaries from all around the country to Milwaukee to rent a succession of downtown rooms and build their collection. After 2 or 3 decades, however, their energy began to flag. The young men were no longer young. Interest in lecture series had waned, and there was no longer adequate money to buy books in quantity. The collection became so tired that circulation just plummeted. Around the same time, there was a rising tide of sentiment for a tax-supported library, a free library, open to everyone, not just young swells, now middle-aged swells who paid for the privilege. Chicago Public opened back in 1873, a nearby model, and that was part of that city's rebuilding after the fire of 1871. And Milwaukee newspapers took up the cause. The Sentinel declared, if a library is a good thing, and all of us believe it is best as a public library. So the focus is shifting. The breakthrough came in 1878 when the Young Men's Association offered its entire collection, 9,958 books, as the foundation, the nucleus of a truly public library. They'd already shed their Yankee cast, this being Milwaukee. Nearly a third of those titles were in German, reflecting the major ethnic group here. The city, of course, wisely accepted that offer. The association's reading rooms on Milwaukee Street was remodeled. The first city librarian was hired at $1,200 a year, about $30,000 currently. And the newly public library opened to a brisk business at 9 a.m. on July 8, 1878. That's the beginning of public library service here. The Sentinel saw that as evidence of a higher civilization. They wrote, "Few advantages of a city can be greater than those conferred by a public library, and it is altogether cheerful to see a disposition to patronize one as so well manifested as in this case." Victorian way of saying people liked it, and they came in droves. Just 2 years later, in 1880, its holdings swelled to around 15,000 volumes. The institution moved to the second floor of the brand new library block above a department store on 4th Street and Wisconsin Avenue. So mixed use has been going on for a very long time in the city of Milwaukee. The reading room there was open to all well-behaved persons, was the qualification, from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. every day, except Sunday when they closed at 2. So 12-hour shifts for the librarians. Unlike Milwaukee's saloons or private clubs, this was an early bastion of gender equality. A library official noted that a separate space is set aside for the exclusive use of women without any prejudice against their making use of any other part of the room if they see fit. But this was not the library as we know it today. The stacks were closed at first, and all books were retrieved by a staff member. Soon, however, Milwaukee tried a bold experiment. Teresa West, who was Milwaukee's head librarian in 1892, described it. She said, "The Milwaukee Public Library, through its reference shelves, opened to visitors with the check of the presence of an attendant in the room. This was," she said, "regarded as a somewhat radical and dangerous step." We're breaking new ground here. Well, she noted proudly that only 6 volumes were stolen in the first 10 years. So, an honest populace. The hope, West wrote, was to someday throw open the shelves of the whole library for some hours of the day at least to any visitor. So access was not anywhere close to what we assume it is today. There was no card catalog for all those visitors. In 1885, the library simply published a book listing the 35,000 volumes in its collection. That was it. It was out of date overnight. What they did was they published a quarterly update, and in time that filled a whole shelf. So it must have been hugely frustrating for anyone trying to find information about Roman history or the habits of woodpeckers to go through all these finding aids to get to the books that were on the shelves or in the stacks. One thing oddly lacking by today's standards was popular fiction, and Wayne describes this amply in his book. In the annual report for 1879, Milwaukee's librarian stated Milwaukee's acquisition policy in pretty clear terms. As to the poor, trashy, and ephemeral productions of novels, which seem to be the delight of the vicious and the vulgar, they should be excluded from our shelves, and this I may safely say has always been the policy of your board. Horatio Alger and all the other kind of pulp fiction pieces were considered not acceptable reading material. A decade later, the record was pleased to report that fiction had dropped from 59% of circulation to 48% in just 4 years. And that was because they didn't buy the titles. So circulation went down quite intentionally. Librarians have long since decided that reading is better than not reading. We have Danielle Steele and Jackie Collins on our shelves along with Louise Erdrich and Margaret Atwood. So that decision's been made a long time ago. With pulp fiction or without it, Milwaukee's collection kept on growing. By the early 1890s, MPL had roughly 65,000 books, reflecting what Teresa West called a Catholic, small c, yet scholarly taste. So useful information was what they were after in those years. The reading room had roughly 75,000 patrons a year, and space was soon at a premium. Milwaukee tried to solve the problem by building a combined library and museum just a few blocks from here at 814 West Wisconsin Avenue, just down the avenue from the law school in Marquette. If the Central Library looks like Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry, it should. That's the model. That is part of the 1893 exposition in Chicago and created a new vogue for the neoclassical, and Milwaukee Central Library is the outstanding example of that style in this city. The landmark opened back in 1898 and was hailed as a milestone of civic progress, along with City Hall itself that was just 3 years old in 1898. The Library Museum was a bold and confident statement of Milwaukee's place in the vanguard of America's cities. So the museum took over the West Wing, the library took over the East. That marriage flourished through the first decades of the 20th century. And there was a nice synergy in those shared quarters. People could see an actual mummy or a stuffed elephant on the museum side, walk across to the other side, and borrow a book on pharaohs or pachyderms. So you had both 3D learning and library as well. Patrons certainly enjoyed that synergy, and it was not until the 1930s that the library encountered any really serious headwinds. With unemployment nearing 40% by 1933, circulation skyrocketed, as always happens in hard times, but the budget went in the opposite direction. Things got so bad that creative librarians actually created makeshift books by clipping serialized novels from popular magazines and gluing them together. And those remained on the shelves for as long as they possibly could, but certainly a short shelf life. No sooner had the Depression ended than World War II began, and once again, high demand was matched by scarce resources. It was not until the late 1940s that the smoke had cleared enough for people to see kind of what was going on with the system as a whole. Central Library had a great many virtues, but space was not one of them, especially when you think that the library had only half of that building. By the mid-1950s, every book published before 1940, so 15 years, 20 years of titles, was in storage, and 15,000 in time rotted beyond repair. So this was catastrophic for the collection. The library and museum were like twins developing in the same womb, and both displayed some rather sharp elbows as they grew over time. The solution was a massive addition. No thought was given to historic preservation or historical continuity. If you've ever wondered why there was so much architectural mayhem in America after World War II, the addition was argued for in terms that make that fairly clear. The library stated there is more wasted, unusable space in the rotunda, inner courtyard, ground floor, halls, and high ceiling corridors than there is usable space for books in the central stacks. So what our parents saw as hugely inefficient, we look at as beautiful today. There are now very popular tours of Central Library, and they begin in that unusable rotunda on 814 Wisconsin. With the active support of Mayor Frank Zeidler, a rather utilitarian addition to Central was finished in 1956, covering half a square block. The museum chafed a bit at having to wait, but the next decade, over time, they moved right across the street and now occupy that major home on Wells. The branches, meanwhile, had shortcomings of their own. Despite its scale and majesty, Central Library had never been a walled-off fortress. MPL has always reached out aggressively to its patrons. For much of the 20th century, small collections, almost mini libraries, were maintained in schools, factories, union halls, hospitals, even grocery stores. So you could walk down to the corner shop and borrow books. A system of genuine branches took shape over time. The first was a stately building, still stands on 10th and Madison, that was built to serve the South Side back in 1910. Today it's the St. Vincent de Paul Center. By 1950, there were 17 branches in all, only 3 of them built as libraries. The rest were rented space like those storefronts I patronized as a kid on Forest Home Avenue. Richard Krug, who had been the director of the library since 1941, announced what he called a new deal for the branches. He planned a system of what he called regional libraries, each serving about 60,000 people. And he envisioned them as supermarkets of knowledge with convenient locations, high visibility, and full service. There were 2 problems, money and geography. Money was not a huge obstacle in the high tide of post-war prosperity, but geography was. He wanted to serve the city most efficiently, and he proposed closing 5 branches, a rather risky strategy for someone whose budget was set by politicians. The affected aldermen howled, but Krug prevailed. By 1968, Milwaukee had a dozen branches, all of them either new or largely rebuilt. The buildings have changed, some radically, but their locations still conform to the template that Krug developed nearly a half a century ago. And all of us in Milwaukee grew up with that system. MPL enjoyed a few decades of relative calm, but starting in roughly 1990, we entered a rapids that has been roaring ever since. And those of you in the system and the profession certainly know it. I say we because I joined the library board back in 1993. In 2014, after ducking the job for about 15 years, I became president. It's been an interesting time to help guide the state's largest system. There have been departures from a circulating art collection to the bookmobile to the card catalog. We said goodbye to paper cards back in 1995 and went all digital. I couldn't begin to count the number of times I bloodied my cuticles, kind of pawing through all those cards in the card catalog. I suppose today we have traded bloody cuticles for carpal tunnel problems. But the information is still there. The larger story in the recent past has been financial stress. Let no one doubt that these are challenging times for America's public libraries. We are in a period of diminished resources and aversion to new taxes. In constant dollars, MPL's annual budget has, from its high point in 1999, dropped nearly 24%. That has meant, as a direct result, our total weekly service hours are down 18% from 2004. And our materials budget, which we target for 12% of the total budget, has dropped to 6.6% in 2009 before rebounding to the last budget to 9.3%. So facing those pressures in 2003 with few other choices, we made the painful decision to close a branch library, Villard Avenue, up in the north side. That decision became an unexpected and finally welcome catalyst. Public outcry was so intense that we looked back on the issue and ended up building Villard Square, a pioneering mixed-use development that has a library on the first floor and grand family housing on the upper three. That's grandparents raising their grandkids. The mixed-use model saves money and builds community connections, a combination so powerful that it's become the template for most of our capital projects looking ahead. Villard Square is just one example of how MPL has responded creatively to the challenges it faces. Under Kate Houston from 1991 to 2006, under Paula Kiley since then, the system has finished a glorious restoration of Central Library, installed one of America's first vending libraries up on the north side, launched new programs ranging from books to go for preschoolers to teacher in the library for older kids, and opened 4 new branches, including 2 mixed-use facilities with 2 more on the way. We still have a great deal of lost ground to make up, but MPL is moving in the right direction. An even larger question is certainly touching libraries of all kinds and conditions. It's become kind of the elephant in the room whenever you have a couple of librarians together talking about the future of their profession. As we look at the word library, the root is liber, which is Latin for book. Books, in their paper form at least, are no longer the major part or the only part of the library's world. As we speed headlong down the information superhighway, as we go from books to bytes, what are the implications for America's public libraries? What is our place in the digital age? When every smartphone is a virtual library, when even the cheapest tablet allows you to read Tolstoy or study the Civil War, why bother with bricks and mortar? I think Wayne has answered that question eloquently in both his book and his talk. Libraries are still places where we learn, where we connect, where we find the guidance and resources to grow on our own. But it's obvious that libraries have had to adjust. It's sometimes said that the nation's great passenger railroads failed because they forgot they were in the transportation business. Instead of adapting, they rode the steel rails to oblivion. Libraries are not making that mistake. In Milwaukee, we are committed to providing our patrons with 21st century service where they live and how they want it. That means ebooks, which have exploded from fewer than 12,000 in 2010, just 5 years ago, to nearly 135,000 today. It means access to electronic databases, which now number well over 100, and it means computers. MPL has 648 public use computers, including laptops, compared to 372 in 2005. That's a 75% increase in just 10 years. MPL has changed enormously since the days when a group of young men huddled around a wood stove in some forgotten hotel lobby to talk about books. It will keep on changing in the years ahead and more quickly than any of us can imagine. But it's the media that change. It's not the mission. It's the forms, not the philosophy. Libraries are among the great constants in American public life. Like its counterparts around the country, MPL has been my library for generations of grateful patrons. We are the level playing field. We bridge the digital divide. We house the commonwealth of our entire civilization. We provide for free what patrons cannot buy on their own. We open the door to larger worlds for everyone, regardless of class or background. Along with public schools, we hold a place at the very heart of American democracy. We stand as a beacon of opportunity for all who would see its light, a gateway to riches for all who would enter in. That is an exalted mission. It's one MPL has been pursuing for more than 140 years now, and one we'll keep on pursuing into a future whose technologies we can't begin to imagine, but whose needs for information, inspiration, and connection will be identical to our own.
Good morning, everyone. Good to be with you. Thanks to John Gerda for that fascinating presentation. It seems appropriate that John has now opened the door to a discussion about what's happening in the Milwaukee Public Library system today. And in some respects, even though John did talk about some of the fiscal realities we face, these are exciting times for the library system, and we're going to spend a little time talking about what precisely is happening. Mayor Barrett, I want to begin with you because you said a few years ago that you were going to double down on the city's investment in libraries, and we do know that it's not always easy making decisions about where public dollars go, but you clearly felt this was important. Tell us what you did and why.
Well, I'll start with why, and I want to first of all compliment John for the great job. He always does a great job. Let's give him another round of applause. He is something else, something else. And there's nothing I enjoyed more than twisting his arm to make him take the presidency of the library board. He likes to be so pure, be the historian. I'm like, no, I want you to get your hands dirty. I want you to see what it's like to do this. But he did a great job in that role. But like him and like everybody else in this room, I had my library. My library was Finney Library. But even before that, my first recollection of the library was actually in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin, because my mom was from Sturgeon Bay, and she had a sister and a brother who lived about a mile apart, and exactly in between was the library. And I can remember probably being 5 or 6 and going there. And one thing I learned at a very young age, library, as great as they are, there's not a lot of good, at least in the Sturgeon Bay Library, there were not a lot of great ideas for April Fool's pranks. Because I thought, I'm going to go to the library and see what pranks I can pull on April Fool's Day. I couldn't find any good ones, other than the salt, pepper share. I'm like, I'm not doing the salt, pepper share thing. But the Finney Library was my library. And then in high school, I used to love going down to Central Library to study, but spending almost all of my time getting big copies of old Life magazines. You know, they had those on the shelves. And when I was supposed to be studying, I would just go through issue of Life magazine. I just loved Life magazine and everything. But when I became mayor, it was right after the Villard Avenue uproar. And this was not a fun conversation at all. And the first couple of years, we're looking at this thinking, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? We're going to have to regionalize. We're going to have to close. And what we did each year is we would get closer and closer, and then we would say, well, let's not do it this year. Let's not pull the trigger this year. And we probably did that 3 or 4 years. And then working with our budget office, we said, what else can we do? What else can we do? I asked them for some options, and Eric Pearson, who is here, I give him credit for helping us come up with a plan where not only did we not have to close libraries and consolidate them, but if we just changed the way we thought about them, we could maybe save things. And I see Howard Snyder, who's here as well, another person who's important in this. He came to us with this great idea. Let's do Village Square. Let's do a mixed use. Now, what's interesting, using John's history lesson here, is early on there were a lot of libraries that were not only libraries. Buildings were only libraries. We think of them as being a branch library, being a library and nothing else. But the history of libraries was that wasn't always the case. And so in a sense, we're going backwards by reinventing that model. And it was so popular in Villard Square, we thought, well, let's do it again. And we had a lot of community involvement in Villard because people were just chomping at the bit to have it. Then we went to East, and Paul has heard me say this, and other people who are from the area have heard me say this countless times. We had a lot of community involvement with Villard Square. People were just so happy to have it. Then we went to East, and what I didn't know...
This is North Avenue.
North Avenue. I didn't realize that everyone who lives on the East Side is an architect. or interior designer. So there was a lot. And sometimes you can really have a lot of community involvement. But we came up with a plan there that worked, and we said, let's do it again, let's do it again, let's do it again. So I'm proud to say by 2020, all 12, and we have not closed the library branch, all 12 of our libraries will be rebuilt or renovated or have an amazing upgrade because we believe in them.
Yeah. Was it a hard sell, Paula, Mayor? And because they're obviously members of the Common Council. There are people who have their own interests that they would like to see advanced in any city budget. Was it a hard sell?
No. I would say it was the hard sell was trying to decide what the right direction was. And as the mayor said, we are very indebted to the budget office for helping us to figure out the financial end of it. When I came on board in 2006, I'd been with the library already for some time, and we had a strategic plan. That strategic plan held one phrase that really started to move us forward. There was a strategy that stated, MPL will develop a comprehensive facilities plan. So in 2007, we started that planning effort, and unlike some of the past plans, we brought in community leaders. In fact, the Lubars were mentioned. Marianne Lubar was part of this, other funders, and other organizations, board members, and we started talking about the future library and what that would look like. And this was at the same time when the budget was starting to become more constrained. Long story short is we came up with a number of options. The mayor mentioned the mixed-use libraries. Another option was consolidation. A third option was what we were calling area libraries, where we would, this was the consolidation. And we went to the community first. And it was we had talked to lots of people, and then we realized, well, we haven't really talked to the people who use the library. So we went to 7 branches and held conversations. This was the real point of sale, to talk to the people who really value those libraries and tell them, really get the facts on the table, tell them what our options were, and get their feedback. And personally, I thought at the time that the best move was to consolidate, to build larger libraries because they would be less costly to operate. But we were able to move ahead with the Villard Square Library. It was extremely successful. We had made a promise in those community meetings that we were not going to close any libraries until a new library was built to replace their library. And with the success of Villard Square, the support of the mayor and the Common Council, we realized that the mixed-use model was the model. No one would lose a library, and we didn't want to go through what we did in 2003.
How did you make decisions on which libraries to replace or which libraries to remodel? You are replacing a number of libraries. I'll use it as an example. There's the Forest Home Library, and that's going to be replaced by a new library at 9th and Mitchell, same area near South Side. But you made a decision, we're going to move to a new location. Why?
Well, when we build new libraries, we take a lot of things into account. Location is very important. And I will tell you, when we started talking about this branch library project, I asked Lucille Krug if I could talk with her. Lou Krug turned 100 years old about 2 weeks ago. I went to her birthday party, and she is the widow of Richard Krug, who really developed this branch library system. And at the time, I wanted to really pick her brain about what Dick, as she called him, what he was thinking about when he cited those libraries. Because on a map, when we look at the 1 mile radius and the 3 mile radius around those branches, they are almost perfectly placed in terms of getting the best bang for our buck in terms of reach. But there were a couple of libraries that were a little bit off. Forest Home is one, Mill Road is the other. Difficulty getting in and out, difficulty finding those. And so we looked at location first. As far as whether to keep the building or not, a lot depended upon how much money was going to be needed to bring those libraries up to where they needed to be. So most of those original branch libraries were built in between 1968 and 1971. So 40-some years ago, still operating on original mechanical systems. Some of them never renovated. So they really...
Cheaper to replace than
it's
repair
cheaper to
or update.
replace.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, the way people use libraries has changed, and how we want to offer service is changing. So to try to retrofit into an existing library that was built 40-plus years ago, really, we didn't think in many cases was the right decision.
Mayor, I want to follow up on something that Paula just said, and it actually goes back to something Wayne was talking about earlier, this sense of place, what these libraries mean to a specific neighborhood or community. In your opinion, what do they mean in terms of the health and vitality of a community?
I think, and this is an important time to have this initiative, because right now in Milwaukee, if you look at the heart of the city, there's a renaissance going on in the downtown area. There's an incredible investment that we're seeing, unlike we've seen in our lifetimes. And not surprisingly, people in the neighborhoods can feel left behind. It is very comforting to me to be able to go into the neighborhoods who look at all this great stuff going downtown and say, well, what about us? What about us? And I can go to Forest Home neighborhood, the neighborhood, and say, you're about to get a new library on Mitchell Street. It's coming. Or just earlier this week, I was down at Tippecanoe Library, which is one we're going to completely, and we're in the midst of renovating that, $4.5 million. So to show them that there's love for them as well. But it's more than just doling out the love. I really believe that they are community centers. And I think in neighborhoods, I think they bind neighborhoods together. One of the interesting changes that has occurred and it really was the North Avenue Library, and now at Tippecanoe as well. Think of a library, and in your mind you think of the library in the main reading room, and then there's the little conference rooms. Well, if you think about it, the little conference rooms are used, 20% of the time? And so a lot of the time they're empty. So at the North Avenue Library, they have a conference room, but they've got walls that can be moved so that if there's not a meeting or a conference going on, it can be a reading area or a computer area, which is very, very important. And so the usage is much more intense. And I think that that's a great use of the space. But part of our vision is to have really enliven or activate the libraries even more. And when I was growing up, the most activated library scene in my life was the scene from Mary and the Librarian. You know, where they're marching around there. That was as loud as it would ever get in the library. And we want to have more activities at the library. We think it makes sense for us to do that. So we're again, we want people to come to the libraries. And part of the theory is you get them in the door, then they're going to come back. We're going to come back. We want these buildings to be used, and we want the resources to be used as well.
So you do a lot of different things at the libraries and at their various branches, but does the mission change at all depending on the location of the library? I asked that. You mentioned, what's going on in the East Library, North Avenue, and then I mentioned the Forest Home Library.
Right.
They're very different neighborhoods, and in many respects, they reflect kind of the traditions of Milwaukee. Sometimes it's new arrivals in our city. Different languages, different needs. So does the mission change depending on where you are in the city?
Well, that's a great question. And I would say the answer is yes and no.
Okay.
Well, the library's mission is truly to help people read, learn, and connect. And connect having multiple meanings. Connecting through the internet, connecting to that useful information, connecting to books, connecting to each other, ideas. So that is a constant. How that is interpreted in every community will vary. I will also say that there are certain programs that every community will value from, and so those are centrally designed and pushed down to the branches. So computer training is one. Job labs, helping people find and prepare to apply for jobs. Early literacy programming. I think John mentioned Books to Go. That is something that's valued at every location and needed. But every branch manager helped us develop the current strategic plan. Okay. And again, unlike some of our past plans where librarians and trustees got into a room and decided what we thought we should be doing for the community, instead what we did is we developed a plan based on data. And we looked at census data, we looked at actual library use data, who was using us, where did they live, what libraries were they using, and then market segmentation data. And what we did was we found that there are some distinct differences. And again, for those of us who have been in Milwaukee, none of this will surprise us, that the needs of people living in the Tippecanoe area, which is where I grew up and where I used the library as a child, are very different from the families living around the Center Street Library. So every branch manager and branch team is responsible for developing area-specific programming. Example, at the Center Street Library, the branch manager called and said, you know, we had a job fair. People were standing outside the doors before we opened waiting to get into the job fair. It was a great, great success. But we didn't have enough computer classes. So all she had to do was send that email. I contacted our wonderful foundation and said, I need $10,000. And they said, okay, you got it. And we were able to expand that program. And that's what every branch manager is responsible for doing, is really addressing the needs of that particular community.
Mayor, I think you've referred to the library system and the libraries as the great equalizer. What do you mean by that?
Well, because in my stereotype of a library, you can go into a library and see a 5-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 35-year-old, an 85-year-old, and they're all there. They're all there learning. So it equalizes us among age, but then among incomes, you can see very wealthy people, poor people. When you were asking the question about the different library uses, I had my flashback was going into Forest Home and seeing the little computer room, which was filled with people who didn't speak English as their first language, looking for jobs. And the room was packed. And so if you look at the numbers of the library, and you could argue, okay, are the numbers up or down? I would argue that these libraries right now are more relevant than they've ever been before. And the reason I make that argument is just on sheer access to educational, and again, John talked about the ebooks and all that stuff, just on access alone, you would think that our numbers would be dropping even more precipitously. And when I say dropping more precipitously, and some libraries are going up, but you would expect to see a precipitous drop. That's not happening. And I think the reason it's not happening, again, just as John said, is that we are trying to meet people where they are in their lives. And by having teacher programs after school, we've got 9 libraries. We serve 10,000 families each year. In the summer, our summer reading program, 25,000 kids read 9 million books. That's the kind of stuff that brings people in. And we know we have to do more, but we have a very agile and a very good staff, and I give a lot of credit to Paul and her staff, because these are very difficult budget times. And they're up against the police budget and the fire budget, and those are tough budgets to be up against. Those are very tough budgets to be up against. But she and her staff are making the case to the policymakers, you have to make these investments. You have to make these investments.
And so what are the biggest challenges? Are the fiscal challenges the greatest challenges this library system faces as it moves forward?
Well, so when I interviewed to be the deputy city librarian, this was when Kate Houston was the director, she asked me that question. She said, what are the 2 greatest challenges that you see going forward? And I said, staffing and budget. And really, that hasn't changed much at all. I think for anyone who works in a public library or who follows library news, that's the case, whether you're an academic library, a school library, or a public library. So I think my responsibility and the responsibility of my team and the board is to figure out what is the best way to use the resources that we have available. And I think we have done a pretty good job of that. I think the building program is a much needed upgrade for us. I think it highlights the value of the library, and it gives communities hope that the city is going to invest in their neighborhood. And people want to live near a library, and they want a library that is inspirational to them. People have asked me, why do we need to replace these libraries? They're fine. And to me, fine isn't good enough. We really need to provide spaces that are inspirational and who will excite kids about learning. So budget will always be an issue. I agree that that's never going to go away. But I think also making sure that we have the right people in the right places, just like any business, any university, getting the right people on board. And we are very fortunate in Wisconsin to have 2 schools of information studies who are graduating some truly excellent librarians, and we've been lucky enough to hire them. So we have a very good partnership with the school. I'm a graduate of UWM, and so we'll deal with those challenges.
Is there, and I'll wrap this up because I want to take a couple questions here from the audience, but public awareness, I know you're working on that as a system.
Yes.
How are we
tuned?
Okay, I was going to say, how are we doing on that? What's
really great, really great. Well,
and why is that so important?
Yeah. So I've been, when we regularly bring people in to see the library and talk to them about how they can get involved, and this is the donor community. And after the tour, we often hear the same phrase, which is, "You are the best kept secret in the city." And it's not that librarians are shy and retiring people, but there's so much. I think there's so much information or so many things out there grabbing for people's attention, and people tend to forget the library. There is, I do think there is a perception that if you have money, that you can get almost everything that you need online. That is not really the group of people we're worried about. We're worried about people who don't have access to those things. So, Brooke, now you've made me lose track of my thoughts.
But it's a good picture.
The awareness campaign. So we're going to be launching an awareness campaign early next year. We have fabulous community partners, including our foundation, CK, Robert W. Baird, the mayor, and you'll begin to see things in the community that will remind our target audiences that we have a lot of things of value for them in the library. And our target audiences, it's not that we don't care about everyone in this room who has a great education, who loves the library. We are trying to reach people who really aren't aware of everything we can do to
people who
support
haven't
them.
been there
The people who, right.
in the last year.
Yes, or ever. We want them to come in and feel comfortable using the library.
I'll give you the final word on that.
Well, I wanted to say something about the library and Paula's staff, and I want to sort of burst the stereotype that librarians are all such good people, and they are good people. But proper, the etiquette and all that stuff. We had big brothers, big sisters. The city got involved having different departments represented in a bowling tournament last fall. And you'll all be proud to know that the loudest and the most successful team was the librarians. So true Milwaukeeans, true Milwaukeeans.
Let's open it up and take a few questions. Again, as Dean Kearney said, if you're in the seating bowl, press down on the rim, not on the ball, but on the rim. And if you're in the back, wait for Ryan to bring you a microphone so we can all hear your question. Yes, please.
This is more a comment than a question, but you could comment on the comment. Very seldom do you hear people address how much money libraries save the user. And my husband and I sat down and figured that the library saves us around $4,000 to $5,000 a year, considering the expense of books, CDs, DVDs, magazines, programs, using the computers and internet, not to mention the expertise of the librarians.
Is that a selling point? Can you make that argument? I mean,
I will address it with the mistake that I made. We had a luncheon, a library luncheon, and it was sponsored by a local book dealer. And I had just, do you remember this?
Yes, I do.
I had just learned about the new app that the library has that would allow you to read the barcode. You could be in a bookstore you could read the barcode, and then you could find out whether it was in the library. And I thought this was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And everybody else did except for the person who was sponsoring the lunch, who did not like the fact that I was in essence saying, you know, just go read the barcode and find out whether we have it. But I hope he's not here. You can do that. You can save a lot of money by seeing whether we have that book on the shelves, and it'll tell you whether it's in circulation and what library to go to. So it can save you a lot of money, a lot of money.
I agree. And as I get closer to retirement age anyway, I think about, okay, do I want to spend $25 on this book, or do I want to put that towards my retirement fund? But there, so many of the e-resources, which I think are of interest to a great number of people, are really just incredible. I was traveling back to Wisconsin yesterday from South Carolina, and I didn't have anything to read. And I thought about today for a long time, and I just wanted to relax. So while I was in the airport, I got access to the Wi-Fi and searched the library catalog, found a book that I felt I should read, and downloaded it and read it on the plane back. I regularly now download magazines. I get an email every week that the New Yorker is available, and I can download it. And so you start adding up these little bits of money, and we do really save a lot of money as individuals. So thank you for bringing up that point.
Let's take another question from the audience. Let me go right here.
Paula, you know what I'm going to ask about. Mixed use down at the Central Library, any apartments going in there? You know, I was down there when they had the tour where they were taking us, showing us where the museum used to be. And we went up to the 3rd floor, and the previous museum director's office would be ideal for me. And late at night, sleep, which probably, if I'm in a library, I'm not going to be sleeping. I could go down and shelf books. So do you see any future of anything like that sort of happening, kind of using up some of the spaces that aren't being used right now?
So Sandy is a regular user of our library for many reasons, and you'll see her volunteering all over the city. But she has brought up the question as to whether or not this mixed-use model would ever be make sense
At the Central Library.
At the Central Library, and I've told her I don't quite see it yet. And I do think that Central Library has some opportunities for us to expand services, but the focus really has been on the branches, and I think that is where it belongs. We finished the renovation of Central Library in, I believe it was 2011, is that correct? 2001. It was 8 years. We started in 93. I should look at Del Wilson, and I think we finished in 01. And we've done a little bit since then. But I think until we finish the branches, we're going to put most of those projects on hold. But I can't blame you. I'd love to go home to the Central Library every night as well. It's a
Well,
beautiful
one of the nice things is when we opened up the roof on the Central Library. If you haven't been there, maybe you can.
There is a green roof on that, as most people in here probably know.
It just, Carole King's song "Up on the Roof," it just jumps out at you when you're there. It's great.
Yeah.
Let's take other questions. Let me go right over here. Yes.
Center Street Library was my childhood library. I'm wondering, where's the funding coming from for the mixed-use developments? It can't all be tax dollars.
You know, that's a great question. Can you explain the business model, why mixed-use developments are the way you're going on this?
So, and I'm going to speak in very rough terms here. Let's say that a freestanding building would be $7 or $8 million. I'm just sort of throwing that number out there. Well, we have built into our long-term plan. So there was a long-term vision here as to what we were going to do with 4 new libraries, 1 total renovation. So we put $21.5 million into our capital borrowing that allows each of those libraries, in essence, to get their $4.5 million. Again, Eric Pearson was the one who came forth and said, okay, we had some refinancing of some debt that we were able to do several years ago that gave us the stream to have this revenue to pay it back. So it was really some good budgeting work by our accounting office. We had the vision, what we wanted to do, but we had to have people who were really, really good at doing that. We've got great support from the Common Council, and Finance Chair Nick Kovac is in the audience, Nick back there, who is a big lover of libraries. In fact, he's He's got amendments right now to try to expand hours, so I'm sure you've got takers there. We got to find out how to pay for them. I don't know what's going to happen to them, but he's been a real advocate for the libraries as well. But it was really, I'd say, the refinancing of the debt more than anything that allowed us to do this, and to have that constant stream of revenue to pay it back.
And I would just add that because we're working with a developer, the developer brings a lot of capital to the project right up front. So our expenditures are to purchase the condominium in which the library will live and to build out the library. And then in that development, there are shared spaces. So for example, we share the roof. Even though the roof it might be 3 stories or 4 stories above us, we own a percentage of that roof. So when the roof needs to be replaced, we only pay for a percentage of it. So long term, there are some real operational savings. We also look to grants to help support some of the projects. At Tippy Canoe, I think the foundation has put in a couple of grants to help fund some of the green features. We also benefit from various tax credits. And at the Forest Home Library, which will be moved to Mitchell Street, we'll be looking at getting some new market tax credits, some historic preservation tax credits. And then, of course, the foundation helps to raise private funds to support things that probably wouldn't be appropriate to be spending city money on, like a fireplace, for example.
Hey, why don't you talk about the fireplace? Because this is a great story.
Oh, okay.
Okay, this is a good story.
So very quickly, when we were doing the Villard Library, and I think, Howard, you were at this meeting, it was the first public meeting, and the architect was showing the drawings of what the space was going to look like, and there was a space or a drawing of the fireplace. And a man raised his hand, and he said, well...
Why do we need that?
Well, he didn't say that. He said, we're not getting that. And I said, well, what do you mean you're not getting that? And he said, that's the kind of thing that suburban libraries do. And I said, well, we are going to give you a fireplace because this community deserves a library that is as nice as any suburban library that you've ever been to. And so they had trouble, this man had trouble accepting that we were going to build a library that would have that kind of amenity.
Very interesting.
So it was fun.
Let me take one final question. Sharon, we should say is on the board of
There,
trustees.
yes, I'm on the board, but another group, back to this development thing that needs to be brought along is the Board of Trustees. I mean, when the mayor appointed me to this board, becoming a developer was something I didn't anticipate. And learning all the different techniques and approvals and making sure the Board of Trustees understood what was going on and acting on for the benefit of the community as well. Thank you.
Other questions? It's a gentleman way in the back. Ryan? Can you hang on a second? Because just for our recording purposes, it'd be better if we have you on the microphone. Thank you so much.
Sure. When you were doing your data research of your card holders to profile them, to learn about who they are and what they're doing, what percentage of them were able to say that they had an email address or within their household had a tablet or a smartphone or had ever read an ebook or an e-magazine?
Yeah. Actually, that's a great question. And I think what you're talking about is sort of the digital inclusion and at what level are our different communities. That's something we did a survey with the help of UWM and asked some of those very basic questions. A lot of people have cell phones, and I'm afraid I don't have that data with me to give you specific percentages, but access to the actual internet and through a smartphone is what seems to be kind of the breakdown point. You can have a phone to make a phone call, but you might not have the kind of phone that's required to access apps and the richness of the internet. So that's why we're providing laptops and desktop computers and free Wi-Fi. I think that in the coming years, in fact, we'll be doing an upgrade of our Wi-Fi system in the next year. It's going to continue to be very important. And it's not uncommon for us to be driving through the city after closing and to see people outside connecting to the internet. They're either I've done this myself. Driving up as close as you can get to the building to connect, sitting outside, plugging into the outside electrical outlets, which is all fine. We see that as appropriate use of a public library. But it's clear that there are segments of our community that do not have access outside of the library. And so that is a very critical service that we provide, and we will continue to do that.
Mayor, I'm going to give you the final word here. Anything you
I want
add?
every neighborhood in the city to know that the city believes in them, and having a library in close proximity to your house sends a powerful message that you're part of the community. And we want people to use these facilities. We want them to use the services there because we want people to be part of the community. And I think the more you show that level of respect, and you show that level of respect through the actual investment, the greater civic engagement that you ultimately have, and the more you can have people help themselves have a better life. So it's an investment that we think is a really important investment. That shows that this is a city who cares about neighborhoods.
We are going to take a 10-minute break, 10 minutes, and then we'll resume again by talking about the future of the American Public Library. But I'd like to say thank you to the director of the Milwaukee Public Library, Paula Kiley, and Mayor Tom Barrett.
Thank you.
We'll enjoy this.
We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Janice Welburn, and I have the pleasure of serving as Dean of the University Libraries here at Marquette. The mic is not on? Oh, now it's on. Okay. I have some challenges, so I'll just bring that down a little. Okay. So, in a forum such as this one, it is tempting to raise questions about the differences between the public library and the academic library. And there are differences. But those differences are probably more important to the people who are employed by them than the people who use them. We can see this in commentaries from outside. In this past weekend's New York Times, one such view came from Alberto Manguel, author of the book Curiosity, who observed that he saw what he saw as threats to the libraries as we have known them over the centuries. And I quote, he says, "The principal danger facing libraries comes from ill-considered changes that may cause libraries to lose their defining triple role as preservers of the memory of our society, as providers of the accounts of our experience and the tools to navigate them, and finally, as symbols of our identity." These issues have to do with more than changing technologies or escalating cost of journals. They are about an economic crisis that, at least in this view, forces libraries into meeting immediate needs locally, everything from budget reductions and cuts to funding for culture, to serving as nurseries, fun fairs, places for the homeless, or social service agencies. These threats are commonly thought of as a way of describing a serious turn in the mission of public libraries. For example, another Times story reported that in California public libraries, some of them are hosting seminars on landscaping during droughts, while another story reported that local public libraries were checking out everything from sewing machines to ukuleles. Academic libraries, some think so, or may think that we have the luxury of retreating to our primary users, students and faculty. And our public image is still deeply connected to the book. A recent story about student unrest at universities in the Ivory Coast referred to university libraries as devoid of books, as a mark of the country's uneven recovery. Having worked as a public and academic librarian, this was a surprise to Joe. I actually thought I was going to become a public librarian and got a taste of academic libraries, and the rest is history. I believe that all of this is a fundamental misunderstanding of both types of libraries. As we remain firmly committed to the preservation of social and cultural memory for generations to come. As Wayne has guided us in his book, public libraries, and I would argue academic libraries as well, are ultimately committed to the lives of our user population or our community. Even during the most difficult times, we are committed to providing space for our users to foster reading, learning, and discovery, to defending our users' free access to information and the exchange of ideals. One can see this shared commitment simply by looking at the workings of the American Library Association. Public and academic libraries each have distinctive divisions within ALA, yet some of the association's most critical efforts are the collaboration it fosters across public, academic, and school and other types of libraries in support of literacy and access. These collaborations are occurring locally and nationally, as Paula and I can attest. Along with our staff, we continue to find common ground and points of intersection between MPL and Marquette. We know that libraries have the ability to change lives. With this in mind, we are also fortunate to have my colleague and my friend Miguel Figueroa here with us today. Miguel brings a new face, a fresh voice and perspective to a new initiative of the American Library Association, known as the Center for the Future of Libraries. The center has a threefold mission. First, to identify emerging trends relevant to libraries and communities they serve, promote futuring and innovation techniques to help librarians and library professionals shape their future. And thirdly, build connections with experts and innovative thinkers to help libraries address emerging issues. Miguel has previously held positions at the American Theological Library Association, the American Library Association Office for Diversity and Office for Literacy and Outreach, the New York University Langone Medical Library, and with Neil Schumann Publishers. He is a graduate of the University of Arizona's Knowledge River program, which is an initiative within the School of Information to bring a perspective of Latino and Native American issues integrated into library and information science. I want to turn this over to Miguel.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Janice. Thank you to Dean Kearney and to the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel and to Mike Goucher for their invitation and hospitality for my participation here. I also really want to thank Dr. Wiegand. I think more than you may realize, you are influencing the work that I'm doing, and so it's wonderful to have this opportunity to bring these things together. There's also a part of me that's really happy to be on a campus that is service for others. Mary Figueroa, my mother, used her teacher salary to send me to private school and Jesuit high school, and it's wonderful to be back in that sort of environment where we are concerned about public issues and concerned about what's happening to communities. So, my name is Miguel Figueroa. I work at the American Library Association, and for the past year and a half, we've initiated a Center for the Future of Libraries. Anyone in academia might know that sometimes center is used as a term for one person working alone on the 7th floor, or 2 or 3 people devoting a third or a quarter of their time to equal something. Such is the case with our initiative. But I think that it's been a really great learning experience for us, and it's a really different direction for the association, and something that has resonated not only with the communities that we talk with outside entrepreneurs and innovators, but also really with the librarians and library professionals that we work with. It is something to inspire and direct our work, I think. And actually, as luck may have it, I guess, today several of my colleagues are in Washington, D.C. with our current ALA president, Sari Feldman, and we're launching a new public awareness campaign titled Libraries Transform. And it's that sort of acknowledgement and assertion that transformation is essential to the communities that we serve. I think that our previous discussion, Paula and Mayor Barnett, really illustrated that libraries are often the best kept secrets in their communities. But we need to amplify that public awareness message. We're very fortunate to have a really solid brand. People know libraries, they think of books, they think of a nostalgic view and an affectionate view of their relationship, whether it's with their school library or public library or academic library. But in truth, libraries are so much more than that traditional idea, and we're deeply engaged in trying to transform people's nostalgia so that they understand that libraries align with our current needs. And so it's that idea that libraries are transforming. We're transforming to meet the needs of an ever-increasing information environment. We all know that there is a wealth of information that can be found on the internet, and your search results will result in millions of hits that are often difficult to navigate and make the most sense of. We're changing to meet the technology needs of today's users. We're changing to meet the needs of the new economy and to provide learners with the skills that they need to succeed in the workplace, but also in their community and civic lives, and to meet users' expectations for convenience and experience wherever they are. Our president really loves the grande caramel snickerdoodle macchiato. This idea that, yeah, you can probably bring your drink into a library and nobody's going to yell at you or anything. We'll make it work. We'll be flexible. And I think that this transformation, this message, lines up really nicely with our approach to the future of libraries. And so I want to start with kind of an academic approach, and I'm sorry to do this, but it is what it is. And this is called the cone of plausibility. And it's a tool that's used by futurists to help think about the future in a more logical way. And I just want to talk about it a little bit because it'll influence some of what I'm going to share later. But it assumes that there is this point, the present. And what it starts to say is that if we really think about it, tomorrow and the next week, and probably into next month, are going to be fairly similar to what we're experiencing today. But that the further out we get into the future, there's an entire realm of plausibilities that could happen. So the further out we get, more different things can happen. There are multiple futures, not a singular future that we inherit. Fortunately for us, though, emerging out of that present is a baseline. And that baseline is composed of the trends that are happening within our current experience. And those trends occur across several different categories. There are trends that are happening in the worlds of education, trends that are happening in politics and government, trends that are happening in environmental and economic issues, and trends that are happening in general society and culture. And so our job, in order to better understand and align our work with the future, is to actually look across those categories of change and really consider them from our own sector. So to say, yes, I'm in the library, but my obsession should not be exclusively with the library. I should be keeping observations on things that are happening across a broad category of change. And once we start to understand that, we can say there are certain trends that will be advantageous to our work, and therefore we might wish to align our services and work so that they follow that particular trend to its fruition. At the same time, there may be also trends that are detrimental to our work, and so we will have to identify those opportunities and either meet them or adjust our strategies so that we can navigate around those potential obstacles. Given that our previous time today has focused on the past, I also love that they view the past as the cone as well going backwards, because we often think that things are written in a very specific way, but I think as Dr. Wiegand's work illustrates, there are lots of stories out there that help us illustrate the actual things that have happened in the past, and we need to find ways to embrace all of those different stories. So, as I talk with librarians, I usually share this quote with them. And it is actually a quote from Skift, which is a market research firm that focuses on the travel and tourism industry. As far as we could possibly get away from libraries, I think. But I think it resonates with how we're trying to help libraries and library users think about the future of libraries. And all I did, I extracted this quote, and everywhere they said travel, I just substituted in the word libraries. And so it says, we are consumer in instead of silos out, being fanatically focused on the changing consumer behaviors across all sectors, not just libraries, whether because of digital tools or globalization or other generational factors, rather than what silos are doing talking among themselves and how that affects libraries and their future. The future of libraries will be defined by leaders who understand the larger context in which libraries operate, not by navel-gazing. And I think that this is true across the libraries that lead in our profession, certainly with Milwaukee Public Library, but also you see other innovative libraries like Anythink in Colorado or Chattanooga in Tennessee. They are led by directors and leadership teams that look outside and try and translate the changes that are happening in the wider community through the lens of the library and try to understand what the library can do for them. The interesting thing, I think sometimes, is that librarians will tell me, they go, well, this is all too consumer focused. And I will say, the problem being what? Like, why should we not be? But it is what it is. I think a lot of people struggle to wrestle themselves from that idea of, well, all of what I'm doing has to happen within this specific box, and the future has to be developed out of this specific institution. Instead, we're saying the future will be guided by lots of changes that are happening outside of our institution, and that the best institutions will be those that embrace that change. So, the primary focus of my work is to identify and help libraries look at these sort of trends. And so we have this trend collection at our website, ala.org/Library of the Future. It is usually an unfortunate slide because in some of my presentations I have this quote that says the 21st century is a terrible time to be a control freak. And then I show them this and I'm like, point in case. No, this is very much the librarian in me. But for every trend, we try and talk about what is the trend specifically, how is it developing, how can we see it in the world today, and then also try and think through with our librarian colleagues, well, what will this mean for the future of the library? As aging advances and we see people being able to live to increased ages, what will that change for our demographics and for the services that we use? Some of them resonate with different libraries. Not a lot of them want to talk about drones yet. I think that's okay. We'll get there. But other things like urbanization are clearly resonant in it, and it forces people to think about these trends in a very different way. I think that this outside-in approach constructs a library that, again, is in line with that, the library in the life of the user, not the user in the life of the library. So it's trying to say, what are our users experiencing? What are the partners that we are working with? What are they experiencing? And how can we make sure that we remain relevant within their lives rather than trying to force them into the life that we're trying to create within the library? So I wanted to spend the last bit of time talking through some possible futures and the trends that might shape them. And again, it's very hard to say this will be the library of the future, to take a specific stance, and I think we already talked about those futurists who in the 90s said the library will be irrelevant. They took a very firm stance, so we don't want to do that. Instead, what I thought I would try and do is talk through 3 possible near and further future scenarios and try and connect those with some current trends that we're seeing in our world to see if they might help us spur innovation or different ways of thinking about the library. And I think for those of you who might be following trends in libraries, especially in public libraries, we might know that 2 of the biggest trends that are currently shaping the immediate future of public libraries are the maker movement and connected learning. And connected learning is learning that is highly social, that's interest-driven, and that's oriented toward educational, economic, or civic opportunity. So it isn't exclusively classroom learning, it's a range of learning that can occur across a range of ages for people to do hands-on activities either with experts or with peers within their community, and they can have lots of different outcomes. I could learn more about science and physics, I could also learn how to sew, or I could learn how to be a better cook or something like that. Those can all be examples of connected learning. And it utilizes social, but also digital media, and connects learners to each other and to a network of formal and informal educators and educational opportunities. One of the great things about connected learning is that it can happen across a range of environments. So we can see it happening in museums, we can see it happening in the classroom, parks and recreation districts are likely engaged in some form of connected learning, and certainly the library can be a part of that connected learning movement as well. The maker movement is, I think, known to most of us, and it is this movement that takes advantage of the availability of access to new technologies and equipment, as well as traditional craft tools. So yes, you can have a loom, and that is still part of the maker movement. A traditional floor loom would be something that makers would use. And it uses improved communication, whether through social media or other platforms, that can help people connect with other people that are interested in a particular making arena, or else experts who can help them better understand a particular area of making. And I think these two trends have really helped public libraries shift from places for content consumption to look instead at content creation. So it is not exclusively about the things that libraries have. We really want people to know that the importance of the things that we have is the things that they can do with them. So that you can activate, of course, books, but also different technology, information resources, so that you can not just learn more from that particular topic, but you can turn that into new knowledge or new prototype or some other system. And we see these changes in different libraries. The Chicago Public Library, which is the photo in the upper left-hand corner, is launching their U-Media program, which really focuses on teens and young people and moves them into production-oriented spaces, whether it's video and audio production or hands-on making, 3D printers, laser cutters, whatever it may be. The fourth floor at Chattanooga Public Library is really looking at ways that they can spur entrepreneurial spirit within their city, and so they're creating a very open space that has access to lots of different technologies, but also links that up to the traditional information resources of the library, so that business communities, but also young people, can learn how to prototype and bring something to market, or they can learn how to do new things that benefit the general city. And I'm sorry, the Chattanooga is in the lower right-hand corner. We also see things like at the Cedar Rapids Public Library, which is upper right. We have very open spaces. We were talking about how we sort of activate these spaces. The great story from Cedar Rapids Public Library, they have great stacks, but they also have lots of open spaces. I guess a Cedar Rapids tradition is the Tuba Christmas, which is traditionally held in a park. Hundreds of tubas, I guess, in Cedar Rapids do Christmas carols, and that Cedar Rapids Public Library said, we have space, come into our space and do this experiment in this new open space, and they have done it. And it's brought in new users and new interest into the library. And finally, one of the really interesting ones, I think, is the Culinary Literacy Center at the Free Library of Philadelphia. This firm belief that we learn a lot from cooking, not just how to cook, but also the literacy and numeracy skills inherent in cooking. It also facilitates a cultural exchange, and it brings in people from different backgrounds and different economic levels around a common denominator of food and experience. And it's opened new opportunities for that library to connect with people, to help them connect with cookbooks, of course, other nutritional resources, and other things that are core to the library's mission, but do it in a very hands-on and active way. So a little further out, I guess, if you're a library purist, some of these new collaborative hands-on spaces may have made you wonder about the future of the stuff. What about the space for stacks and the opportunities to browse? And I think that those are areas that are also ripe for change. They're clearly passionate for a lot of people, and I think people have a strong connection for that to libraries, but we have to find new ways to make those things available, especially as we try and accommodate an increasing range of learning opportunities that will require more collaborative spaces and open spaces. And so I usually start talking with people about Gallery 1 up in the upper left. Gallery 1 is at the Cleveland Art Museum. If you haven't had a chance to see it, it's fascinating, I think. And what Cleveland Art Museum did was they partnered with a firm called Lead Local, and they designed a space and experience that essentially digitized the entire permanent collection of the Cleveland Art Museum. And they've created these massive electronic digital walls that people can scroll through to find the particular pieces that they're interested in, and then they can download them to their mobile devices. That download also facilitates a physical, real-world experience where they can take those pieces and scan different items within the museum and receive some augmented information about each of those individual pieces. It's interesting because it creates that search and browse function, but in a truly digital and physical experience. Jake Barton, who leads Gallery 1, calls it the Fidgetal. physical and digital. And he believes that more of our experiences will become phygital because the digital facilitates ease of access, but the physical is inherent to who we are as humans. And so this is a great series. It harnesses all of the knowledge of the curatorial staff of the Cleveland Art Museum. So could this type of idea translate into the library world? And certainly as news of the Google Book settlement came out a couple of weeks ago, my mind immediately went to this idea that legal structures are finding the scanning projects to be transformative in nature, to perhaps align with our traditional ideas of fair use policies. And I started to wonder, well, is there a way for libraries to harness that mass digitization project and link those digital files into their search experience to create very efficient walls that are available for browsing, from which people could then download the information of the records that they want or preview some of the content that they want. And then we'd facilitate storage measures or other things, drones, robots, to retrieve from stacked contents the actual physical items that these digital opportunities open to us. And we see some of this movement already in initiatives like the Digital Public Library of America, which is really trying to harness the digitization processes that have happened across libraries and create a common digital platform for a primary experience, for a place for us to first dig into these items that we want to access, but then it also gives us further information about where we can encounter the physical element that we so desire. I think that it aligns with a lot of different trends like mass digitization and the datafication of lots of different things. It would also bring in those opportunities for robots and drones and other forms of delivery. And it would allow us to have more space to do the flexible things that we want to do while still respecting that desire of serendipity and of actually stumbling across something new and different. I also think of this from one of the great things about Gallery 1, so you can pick red art or you can pick art that has a similar shape or something. And if you're ever in Reader's Advisory in a library, inevitably someone will come up and say, I don't know the title or the author, but the book was blue. So you could do that. Like you could just type in blue book and boom, all the blue books would come up and you could sort through them. Come on, it's a common issue that we could be solving with these. But this is probably a much further out future. I mean, it requires the cost of these items to go down. It could require the introduction of graphing interfaces or other things to make these truly slim and flexible and make them available on walls and other things. But it's that sort of idea of how would we translate our traditional idea of the library into a more digital environment. Thirdly, I guess, and finally, one more future, and I kind of take this from that, the library and the life of the user, but outside of the physical space. We do talk a lot about the importance of the physical space, and I think one of the things that I often think about is this compulsory nature. You don't have to come to it, but in order for the library to have value, you do have to come into the space in a lot of ways. But we're starting to see more and more city initiatives that harness the power of the Internet of Things, of smart objects, of data everywhere. And so we start to see things. The larger photo is a mock-up of Chicago's Array of Things. And it's an urban sensing project composed of interactive, modular sensor boxes that would collect real-time data and provide citizens with useful information. So it might be able to notify you of changes in weather patterns, or it could notify you of an ice patch that's further on the sidewalk where you haven't encountered. It would send you a push notification for that. Link NYC, which is the photo with the Empire State Building, is again a communications network repurposing the payphones in New York City to make them into kiosks that would offer free services like high-speed Wi-Fi, phone calling services, and device charging stations. And again, these are scattered throughout the city, so they're trying to activate them in new and different ways. And then we have something like the Moscow Virtual Library, where commuters can scan a code while waiting on the platform, and then they can browse and download over 100 ebooks from classic Russian authors like Gogol and Chekhov and Pushkin. So they can activate what would normally just be a passers-by experience into a literary experience. And so I guess I wonder, will the public library of the future find ways to package their content and information and align with a culture that is increasingly push-dependent? We all know that on our mobile phones, we often get push notifications that remind us of different things, Could the library find new ways to push relevant information, whether it's aligned with changes in climate, or even if it's homework helpers that release when children come out of the schools for the day and align with their parents picking them up, where we push information to them to make sure that they're helped with their homework? Or could we activate public spaces like parks or even subway platforms or bus stops with opportunities to read instead of opportunities to just check email or something else? And this is a use of smart data. It's a use of a deployed nature within our cities and urban environments. And it's a use of the digital content that libraries will increasingly have access to and will be increasingly interested in pushing towards users. I think that those are interesting ideas that we can all kind of start to understand. They are not yet fully formulated, but we can see how these are all ideas that connect to existing trends that most of us have at least had some flavor of. These aren't so far out that we can't imagine them. We start to put the pieces together as that happens. I've been most happy in my work because as we start to talk with librarians and library supporters and translate these outside trends to our internal missions and priorities, I think our opportunities for innovation increase. Librarians immediately start to understand that what is happening in the larger context has information that we can take and repurpose in our own spaces. One of the funnier things, I don't know why, librarians suddenly understand the future of our space when we start to look at the fast casual movement in restaurants. And I don't know why that connection had not been made, but as soon as I bring up Chipotle or Panera Bread Company, they're like, that is why the front of our libraries are now glass, and it is why you can see into our spaces, and it is why it's flexible seating. But it is that idea of intentionally illustrating the outside needs of users and translating that into our interior professional lives that will help us change and transform into innovation. So those were just 3 views of how many different trends might emerge in the near and more distant futures. And I'm always very happy to talk with librarians about trends. I think there's no shortage of idea of how our institutions will maintain and gain relevance in the future. I'm also particularly interested to talk with members of the public, library users, non-library users, about some of the trends that they're seeing that could help influence our own work. It really has to be a partnership to construct the future. It is a process of navigating multiple trends in order to maintain relevance. I don't think any public library is going to be able to chart their course into the future alone. They have to do exactly the things that Milwaukee Public Library is doing by bringing in community partners and experts and talking with them in new and different ways. So I thank you, and I'd be happy to hear comments and questions and to engage in larger discussions around these ideas or other trends that might be of interest.
Thank you, Miguel. That was wonderful. So we will take questions. We're going to start, curiously enough, with a question from me. I asked this on behalf of someone in the room. Could I get a show of hands as to how many of you are either trustees or friends of a public library? Okay, so I have now discharged my obligation to the person who asked me. Okay, so questions. Yes, there's one way in the back, and if you can wait for the microphone to make its way to you, and then I will step aside and...
I do have a pretty loud voice. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks, everyone, for this program. I would like, if I could, to try to establish a link from Wayne's work to Miguel's work. My name is Joyce Latham. I'm with the School of Information Studies at UWM. The history of public libraries shows us that libraries have always been early adapters of whatever technology is out there. Public libraries in many communities had the first telephone in the neighborhood and allowed people to come in and use the telephone. Public libraries used to have listening afternoons for people to come in and hear recordings on the newfangled record player. All right? Chicago Public Library, which has the U Media, before that, had a recording studio in analog mode. And the point that I'm trying to make is that just because the formats have changed, just because we've gone from analog to digital, does not mean that the vision or the mission of the library has changed. Public libraries have always been visionary. They've always been engaged in transforming their communities. And I always argue that just because it's digital doesn't mean that our mission all of a sudden has to change into something else. We have continuity that we can draw on and our future, and I think people can rest assured that libraries do know how to implement public libraries for the near future.
Okay, thank you. Could we have questions? Yes, can you press the rim?
Yeah. Dr. Wygren talked about the disconnect between how librarians are trained and what they really have to do. How does your work inform that, and what kind of changes would you make in how librarians are changed?
So my immediate response, I guess, is oftentimes when I talk to people about these trends, I try to activate their lives outside of the library. Because I think we have tremendous talent and diversity often in our staffs, and if we encourage them to think through their lens as a parent of a child, as somebody who supported a kid through college or something, what did you observe through that process? What were the trends that you are noticing in all of your outside lives outside of the library, and how can you translate that in through the lens of the library? And I'm often surprised that a lot of staff members don't think of their professional work in that way. They somehow divorce or separate what they do from the 9 to 5 from what they experience in the outside world. And I try to say that will be an increasingly important part of our professional work. We'll be harnessing the skills we have as librarians, that perspective, those tools, the understanding the mission of the public library or any library, and then saying, okay, how does that affect how I see all of the other parts of my life? And that can sometimes be a tough thing to do. I don't know how library education addresses that. I think really good library educators have people think critically about the outside world and then see it under the library lens.
Other questions? Yes, can you press the rim down, please?
How do you see the future of tribal libraries or libraries in similar underserved communities? How do they catch up to these possible futures that you've shown us?
So I knew this question was going to come up. Actually, I thought about it from the terms of rural, but you're absolutely correct, of tribal as well. So I think one of the interesting things that's happening is one of the pressing trends is urbanization. And we're going to start to see more and more people flooding into urban environments. As that is happening, I think it's often easy for us to say, well, how is the rural libraries to survive? How is the tribal library to survive? In truth, I think they do an excellent job many times in their own communities. Because they are so connected to a community, they have found a way to make themselves a vital and relevant space because they have no other choice. And it's funny that even now in urban areas, we're seeing this move towards creative placemaking or ethical redevelopment, which are essentially opportunities to transform a very large-scale urban environment into a very close-knit community environment. And that reminds me immediately that rural and tribal libraries often do those types of things. The greater threat, I think, from rural and tribal libraries is not their relevance, but will they have a user base that will continue to occupy the spaces that they're in. So they are starting to see increased aging in rural and tribal areas. Lots of people are not coming back. They leave for college or other things and they don't come back in their same spaces. So I worry that perhaps they will be subsumed by larger systems, more sprawl across suburban systems or something like that, and will lose a little bit of that very niche, hyper-localized, hyper-focused attention that rural and tribal libraries are able to provide.
Other questions? Yes.
How do you translate taxpayers' historical view of the library with the trends of the future and make it relevant and get them invested to believe in it?
I think a lot of that is that libraries transform idea. I think we're in a moment right now where it's very hard for taxpayers to think in terms of why should we fund a warehouse of books. And so a lot of people are stuck in that nostalgia of what a library used to be, and it's difficult to reconcile with the reality that we have right now. But if you look at spaces like Gallery 1 at Cleveland Art Museum, by introducing that space, they've reactivated that community. Their attendance is way up. It's changed the idea. I loved the aspirational aspect. We want to create aspirational experiences for people because I think when you transform their expectations and give them something that is truly inspiring, that is truly transformative, like Gallery 1 was at Cleveland Art Museum, they would probably be more willing to fund new initiatives and to see those types of things change. That would be my perspective.
We have time for one more question. Yes.
It's a new library grad, but I have a question about something that I saw with, it was I think Occupy Wall Street and some of the large conventions, where there were actually reference librarians out on the street mixing in and providing reference services to that temporary community. And I wondered if you could speak to whether that's gone on at other libraries, and are libraries doing that, or were this just rogue librarians?
So I think that somehow connects to a longer trend that we're starting to see, this nature of pop-up. And we're seeing that in retail environments and restaurant environments and other places, that organizations or institutions can pop up in a particular space to activate a community, to support a particular community, and they survive so long as that community needs them or until they take firm root within them. And so certainly the Occupy Wall Street movement was a community that actually physically came together, and I think some librarians looked at that community and said, like any other community, they likely have information and access needs, and so they saw opportunities to be flexible and to pop up. And that once you pop up, I think people are much more familiar with that idea that something that was not there will suddenly be there. And so we start to see public libraries start to do things around farmers markets, and they take books on bikes, they take books to the beach, etc., and create that sort of unexpected but useful. And when we connect it to that idea of, yes, this does have utility even in this space that I wasn't expecting, I think we can see more support and greater interest in the services and work that libraries perform.
Thank you. I think we're going to conclude. Thank you, Miguel. I want to conclude with just a few thank yous, primarily on behalf of both Dave Haynes and the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and for Mike Goucher and the rest of us here at Marquette Law School. These thank yous certainly especially go to our participants, beginning with Wayne Wiegand, who truly did inspire this program, and running from Charles Franklin to John Gerda, and to Mayor Barrett and Paula Kiley, and finally to Janice Welburn and Miguel Figueroa. We are so fortunate to be able to draw on such expertise. It's also necessary if we are to do these programs, because the expertise of the law school is not focused on public libraries per se any more than it is on a number of the other topics that we pursue and explore. At the same time, this general topic is one for which I think that we at the law school can claim some particular affinity. For, in a sense, as those of you who have been with us in Eckstein Hall on more occasions than this may appreciate, Eckstein Hall really is designed as a large library. The books are all located in the northeast corner of the building on all 4 floors, but it is a library without borders, as we call it, and it flows without even walls, let alone turnstiles, into the other parts of the building, in particular the various community areas of the sort that Wayne described. This was very much the joint vision of all of us involved in the building project, including our law library director, Professor Patricia Cervinka. So thank you for coming today to our library, as it were, for this program. I imagine that we may see some of you back again, because you are all now on Christine Wilczynski-Vogel's email list. So thank you.